We have three people to introduce our morning's events. I'm delighted that we're going to be officially welcomed by the interim dean of the McCourt School of Public Policy, Professor Thomas Dallaire. Here at Georgetown University, we are hosted by the McCourt School, and we are very warmly welcomed by the McCourt School. We really appreciate the welcome. He will then be followed by Professor Paul Bartholomew, who's the Vice Chancellor of Ulster University, and by Ciara Delaney, the Political Counsellor at the Embassy of Ireland. The Washington Forum on Northern Ireland, you'll hear this spoken about many times today, is a joint operation by Georgetown University Global Irish Studies, by American University's School of Public Affairs, and by Ulster University. And we are supported by many people across the city and across the Atlantic, from the Embassy of Ireland, the Northern Ireland Bureau, the Northern Ireland Office, and many more. So we really appreciate all of your support, and I will hand over now to Professor Dallaire.
Good morning. I'm Tom Dallaire. I'm the interim dean of the McCourt School, and for those of you who are here for the first time, welcome to our beautiful new home here on Georgetown's new Capitol campus, which, as you can see, is located in the heart of Washington, D.C. Here at the McCourt School, the mission of our 5 graduate programs is to tackle complex issues of today and to inspire and empower the leaders of tomorrow. We're a community of global citizens conducting policy-relevant research, building bridges between our work and the communities we serve. I share this background about our school because it dovetails nicely with the work that you all do every day, highlighted by today's important event, the Washington Forum on Northern Ireland. The Washington Forum is a collaboration between American University's School of Public Affairs, Georgetown University's Global Irish Studies Initiative, and Ulster University. The goal of the Washington Forum is to offer an annual meeting in Washington, D.C. for politicians and civil society leaders from Northern Ireland to bring to a U.S. audience an up-to-date, comprehensive look at Northern Irish society, culture, and politics today, and to provide a space for meaningful engagement between U.S. and Northern Irish stakeholders. We are proud to host the 3rd annual meeting of the Washington Forum here at Georgetown University. And I do have the pleasure of having a long list of people to thank. I'd like to thank the Washington Forum Committee for organizing today's event, including American University professors Kimberly Cowell-Myers and Carolyn Gallagher, Ulster University professors Duncan Morrow and Johnny Byrne, Georgetown University professors Colleen Parsons and Dara Gannon. And I'd also like to thank the many groups that have supported the Washington Forum, including the Northern Ireland Bureau, the Northern Ireland Office, the Embassy of Ireland, the Washington Ireland Program, the John and Pat Hume Foundation, and the Helfet family. Next, I'd like to extend a special welcome to our speakers, including the Right Honourable Hilary Benn, MP, the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland, Deputy First Minister of Northern Ireland, Emma Little-Pengoli, U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, Sharon Hudson-Dean, U.S. Consulate General Belfast, James Applegate, Embassy of Ireland Counselor, Ciara Delaney, Professor Paul Bartholomew, Vice Chancellor of Ulster University, and Chief Constable John Boucher of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. I'd also like to acknowledge some of our distinguished guests who are here in the audience, including Congressman Bruce Morrison, Richard Cushney, Director of the Northern Ireland Bureau, Lyndon Hughes Jennett, Northern Ireland Attaché to the British Embassy, Susan Davis, co-chair of the Ad Hoc Committee to Protect the Good Friday Agreement, Professor Orla Feely, President of the University College Dublin, and Nicola Skelly, Executive Director of the Washington Ireland Program. And finally, I would like to welcome representatives of our university partners with whom we work very closely on all things related to Northern Ireland and Ireland, especially Professor Kathy Gorman-Heenan, Provost of Ulster University, and Professor Vicki Wilkins, Provost of American University. So again, welcome to the McCourt School. We hope you enjoy your day here. And now it is my pleasure to welcome to the podium our distinguished guest, Professor Paul Bartholomew, Vice Chancellor of Ulster University.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming to this, our third annual Washington Forum on Northern Ireland. As many of you will know, Ulster University was named UK and Ireland University of the Year this year. And I know that we've been kind of dining out on that a little bit, but it's worth really noting about, what that was all about. And in a large part, it was because of the consistency of our commitment to people, place, and partnership. Not only in what we do, but in how we do it. This event today, I think, brings all three elements together in a very particular way. Firstly, because it's about hearing from and engaging with people who make and have made a significant contribution to Northern Ireland. Above all, its ongoing transition from a society defined by its legacy of conflict to one characterised by a shared commitment to peace and prosperity. And that's really important to us as an organisation. And each of our contributors brings a unique insight into the challenges and opportunities of change. And new governments in London, Dublin and Washington mean that political relationships and therefore the political agenda in Northern Ireland have been reset since we last met. At the same time, and happily, government in Belfast has set aside some of the turmoil of recent years and has now agreed a programme for government. Gradually, but unmistakably, politics in Northern Ireland has turned its attention away from polarised rhetoric towards the delivery of everyday improvements. And while challenges of budget, security and the legacy of violence have not completely disappeared, the issues dominating the agenda of policing are increasingly shaped by the complexity of Northern Ireland today rather than in the past. It's therefore a good moment to hear from people with leadership responsibilities in these areas as they take stock of the risks and opportunities now in front of us, and we're very privileged to have the Chief Constable with us. Place is important to us too at Ulster University. It's an integral part of the life in Northern Ireland as an organisation, providing world-class education to a young and changing population and producing research which ensures Northern Ireland can benefit from the best in science, technology, health, business, and I think also crucially, the arts. Over many years, academics and students in Ulster University have been at the forefront of efforts to contribute to a shared and better future. Our recent decisions to move our largest campus into the centre of Belfast, and now to greatly expand our campus in Derry, Londonderry, have had positive implications for the region, even across borders and far beyond the boundaries of our campuses. Today's event is a further demonstration of our commitment to provide a platform for the sharing of ideas in the most complex and difficult areas without which Northern Ireland cannot thrive. Thirdly, this is a wonderful demonstration of partnership. Our collaboration in this forum with American University and Georgetown University has become an established element in a busy March calendar for all things Irish in Washington. And I'd like to express my thanks to our partners for their continuing commitment and energy, not only in planning and delivering this event, but in offering hospitality in this really wonderful venue. It's truly been a joint enterprise, and we look forward to continuing to work together in future years. So, ladies and gentlemen, in the midst of the frantic activity of this week, this is an opportunity to take stock, to reflect, and to hear from people making important decisions for our future. Thank you once again for coming, and I'd like you, look forward to our conversations. I'd like now to introduce Ciara Delaney for her remarks.
Good morning, friends. It's a real pleasure for me to represent the Embassy of Ireland at this year's Washington Forum on Northern Ireland, organised so ably as always by the Global Irish Studies Initiative. As a child of the 70s, born just at the end of the 60s, but grew up in the 70s, through the entirety of the Troubles. And I was a relatively junior diplomat then at the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. This is a personally meaningful occasion for me to speak at, so thank you. And today is also an opportunity to restate once again the Irish government's heartfelt thanks for the ongoing engagement of the United States with efforts to deepen and sustain peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland. The conversation here highlights the depth and breadth of that engagement. It runs from politics at the highest federal level, as we saw this week in the White House, and at the Capitol, and right through to state and local levels. Importantly, for decades, there has been sustained, unstinting, and across-the-aisle support for Ireland and the Northern Ireland peace process, From the earliest days in the 1970s, with the meeting first between Senator Ted Kennedy and John Hume and Bonn, all the way through President Ronald Reagan and the Anglo-Irish Agreement, and on to President Clinton and to Senator George Mitchell, who shepherded the 97-98 negotiations through to fruition in the Good Friday Agreement. However, that was not the end of the engagement. There was ongoing support from the Bush administration as the process hit bumps along the way. And envoys like Richard Haas and Mitchell Rees worked hard to support the negotiations leading to the St. Andrews Agreement. And I want to acknowledge the work of so many US envoys, including Paula Dobriansky, who I had the pleasure of meeting the other evening at our embassy reception, and most recently Mick Mulvaney, who was appointed by the first Trump administration, and Joe Kennedy, of course. This is a long list of US envoys to Northern Ireland, and it's a testament to the sustained and enduring American commitment and engagement. As the Taoiseach said in the White House on Wednesday evening, we know building peace is a difficult and painstaking task, but when the mighty United States of America puts its shoulder to the wheel, there is no mountain it cannot move. And we don't take that engagement for granted. Some might say that the bipartisan ground is narrowing, but Ireland and Northern Ireland are firmly in that space. This time last year, we were in effect celebrating the return of the devolved institutions, and in some ways that seemed enough after a challenging few years. But 12 months on, we can see those institutions working well and delivering. A programme for government has been adopted for the first time in nearly a decade. The executive is getting down to the difficult business of addressing ordinary issues facing people in their day-to-day lives. It's what Senator George Mitchell called the bread and butter issues. And that matters so much to the people in Northern Ireland to see the executive working for them. And we'll have a chance to hear from Deputy First Minister shortly. And the North-South Ministerial Council is also now back up and running and bringing ministers from both sides of the border together to work for the betterment of their communities and for the island of Ireland, north and south. I had the pleasure of having a conversation with Minister Mike Nesbitt myself the other evening and heard some wonderful ideas from him about cooperation in the health sector that would make a real difference to people's lives. There are also new governments in place in Dublin and London. Last week saw the first Ireland-UK summit take place in Liverpool. In substance and in symbolism, that was an important meeting, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to hear from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland shortly. As he said himself, actually, just at the breakfast that many of us were at, it's our two governments who are the co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement. But beyond that, the links through people, business, culture, and history, a complex history, they run so deep that we have to work together and work well together. There are still difficult issues on the table, and I know there's incredible interest here in America, in Congress and in civil society, in the UK's controversial Legacy Act. The Irish government welcomed the commitment of the new British government to repeal and replace that act. And I know the Secretary of State and the Taoiseach, Simon Harris, have already had some detailed discussions of those issues. As so many of our friends in the US know, addressing the past effectively is essential to the future in Northern Ireland. The new programme for government in Ireland recognises this and says that it will, and recognises our own responsibilities too, and says that it will play our full part in legacy processes and address the legacy of the conflict in the Irish jurisdiction, including facilitating and supporting the OMA inquiry. In that context, I want to thank the Chief Constable, John Boucher, for the work he did in his previous role as head of Operation Canova, building trust with victims and families and tackling very difficult issues. So your interest in specific issues, like in legacy, but more broadly in the peace and prosperity of Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, is invaluable, and we thank you. I am sure today's discussions will add interesting perspectives to our shared interest. So I'll finish by saying Lá Éilif Pádraig Tuna Díobh Galéir. Happy St. Patrick's Day to everybody. And now ask to welcome, please, James Appleby, the US Consul General in Belfast.
While our next speakers make their way to the table, I'll begin. My name is James Applegate, and I'm in charge of the U.S. Consulate in Belfast. Very much honored to be here today.
And I'd like to thank Georgetown, American, and Ulster, and everybody who made this happen. Ulster University of the Year, I hadn't heard. I would have thought you'd mention that, Paul. I'm shocked. I know we have a range of experiences with Northern Ireland in the room, so including some who know far more than me. But if you'll indulge me, I think it's helpful to kind of set the stage before we turn it over to our speakers. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement, as we've already heard today, brought a formal end to the 30-year conflict known as the Troubles. And while the history of peacemaking is longer and more complicated than that one negotiation, the agreement proved to be a watershed. Perhaps less well known by those of you who might be less familiar with Northern Ireland is that the agreement also set up the devolved institutions that run Northern Ireland to this day, including the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive. The agreement enshrined the principle of power sharing between Northern Ireland's two proud traditions, Protestant, Unionist, or Loyalist on one side, and Catholic Nationalist and Republican on the other. The executive that runs Northern Ireland is led by two equal heads of government. They are required to take all decisions jointly, from big decisions like the recently agreed to program for government we just heard about, to smaller ones like who will represent Northern Ireland at events like this. The First and Deputy First Minister take all of those decisions together, and despite somewhat misleading titles, it is a joint office. We hear in Washington a lot the term rhino, Republican in name only. I would submit that our guest today is a dino, a deputy in name only. The two largest parties even need to agree on the formation of government, and as we also heard earlier, for about 4 years out of the last 6, Northern Ireland was without a devolved government, because one of the two largest parties blocked the formation. That all changed just over a year ago when the executive was restored. Michelle O'Neill became First Minister, and one of our speakers today, Emma Little-Pengelly, became Deputy First Minister. I'm probably not the only one who remembers the inspirational session last year at Georgetown's other campus, and I am delighted that the Deputy First Minister is back with us today. For the last year, she has modeled the kind of inclusive leadership that Northern Ireland needs, wants, and too often in the past has lacked from its politicians. She's been a proud advocate for her community, but has also had the courage and confidence to make historic efforts to reach out to the other side. She has brandished a sword at an event commemorating the landing of William of Orange in Ireland, and a camogie stick at a visit to a Gaelic athletic club. And can I just say, she looked alarmingly comfortable with the sword. She's also a true policy wonk, willing and able to dive into the details in the hopes of making life better in Northern Ireland. She's a tireless advocate for the people of Northern Ireland, which I am sure that President Trump learned on Wednesday. The people of Northern Ireland have noticed, and with recent polling showing her as the most popular political figure in the region. In addition to Deputy First Minister, she has been a member of Parliament, a member of the Northern Ireland Assembly, and an advisor to 2 First Ministers. Emma, welcome to Washington. It is truly important that you are here today, and thank you for making the trip. Emma is joined on stage by my colleague at the Department of State, the Deputy Assistant Secretary in the State Department's Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, Sharon Hudson-Dean. In addition to a range of other responsibilities, Sharon is in charge of overseeing the Washington side of U.S. policy towards Northern Ireland, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. She has served as Chargé d'Affaires and Deputy Chief of Mission in Oslo and Riga, and as Consul General in Sydney, Australia. Tough assignment. Her other diplomatic assignments have taken her to Washington, Russia, Georgia, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Nepal. She holds degrees from Johns Hopkins and from Georgetown. Our moderator today will be American University Associate Professor of Government, Kimberly Cowell-Myers. Kimberly's work has included research on how representative democracy functions, women in politics, and ethnic politics in Northern Ireland, so she is especially well placed to lead this discussion. Kimberly recently committed, along with Carolyn Gallagher, her latest book on Irish America's influence in the wake of Brexit, called Building the Green Wall. So if anybody's looking for some reading for the flight home, I can recommend it. And without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Kimberly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James. My first question would be to Emma, and to say, Emma, it's been a year since we sat together with Michelle O'Neill at the Washington Forum and talked then about your very new government. In the year since then, you developed a program for government, a legislative program, and also accomplished a draft budget. Would you like to bring us up to date on what's been going on since then, what the work ahead looks like, what your priorities are?
Okay, thank you. Can I firstly say what a huge pleasure it is to and privilege to be here with you this morning. This is my last event of a very, very busy week, so I can only apologise to those in the room that may have heard me talk all week about similar things that I'm going to do and speak about today. But it's great to be here, and this week has all been about championing Northern Ireland. That's a job that I'm in post to do, and we've had such a wonderful time this week speaking to so many people, particularly because of that change in administrations. You know, we've got that quite a unique situation, I think, where we've had that within the last year, change of administration in the Republic of Ireland, a change of administration and Prime Minister in the UK, and of course the change in the team and the president here in the US. So there are a lot of people to get to know and to speak about and speak to in terms of the issues that we are engaged with in Northern Ireland. But I'm really pleased to say, in the year since we sat in your beautiful library over at the other campus last year, that we've been working really hard to create that stability. And I've been really glad that we've been able to continue. I hope people in the room would agree that positivity in the leadership that both Michelle O'Neill and myself are trying to show to the executive. But I also feel that all of the executive members have been working really constructively together. We've a new health minister since I sat here last year in Mike Nesbitt, and I see that Gordon Lyons, our communities minister, who's responsible for culture, sport and our communities and regeneration, is here as well. So, you know, I do believe it's an executive that's working really well. For those in the room that's not overly familiar with it, we have a 4-party coalition, a mandatory coalition in Northern Ireland, and we've got parties right across the political spectrum, from left to right, economically, socially, and of course very different ideas about the big constitutional question as well. So it's not easy, and I think a lot of people recognise that, but I'm really pleased that we were able to get that programme for government together. It was actually 14 years since the last one was agreed, and that ran for a number of years. So it was a difficult process, but I'm really pleased that we got that unanimous agreement across the executive. And that's about the prioritisation of 9 key priorities. Because for me in the executive, we are now moving on to that critical period where it has to be about delivery. Like, we're very conscious that it's not just the symbolism of us coming together. It's not just us signing up to these documents or saying words for word's sake. You know, I do think people are much more nuanced in that they know and they feel and they want delivery from their government. I don't think that's unique in Northern Ireland. I think when you look at the big change that's happening right across the world, a lot of that is happening because of the frustration of ordinary people who are frustrated with their lives, that want their government to deliver for them. We're no different in Northern Ireland, and that's very much what we are moving on to try to do over the course of the next 2 years, which is the remainder of our term.
Great, thank you. I guess I wanted to ask you some about that hard work of finding common agendas across political divides, and given the many successes of the executive, I think a lot of people are very curious about your formula for success there and how you are able to work so closely with Michelle O'Neill and the other political parties across these divides. Can you give us some insight that other coalition leaders might benefit from in terms of how you make this work?
But I think, first of all, you need that willingness, I think, across all parties to want it to work. I think without that, then, you know, you don't have people engaged in trying to compromise or to be pragmatic, and I think that can be challenging. I've also had, I think, the real privilege of seeing this work and not work with different administrations, because I served as a special advisor since 2007. So for a year with Dr. Paisley, for a number of years, 2008, 2015, with the Right Honourable Peter Robinson when he was First Minister. Both of those men, along with Martin McGuinness, who was the Deputy First Minister then, and also to see the Arlene Foster-Michelle O'Neill relationship as well within that office. And that, for me, has been an incredible learning experience, because you do see the formula of what works at times, but you can also see how quickly things can become unravelled. And, you know, for me, it was very much about, and this was the very first conversation that Michelle O'Neill and I had, which is like, we know there are many, many things that we are not going to agree on, not least the final destination, or the destination of where we end up as Northern Ireland and on the big constitutional question. But again, in politics, just because our politics is very, very different, we're not going to agree on many things. But what we did know was that we agree on a number of things, key issues like trying to fix our health service, bring down those waiting lists, an affordable childcare strategy for Northern Ireland, ending violence against women and girls. Northern Ireland was the only part of the British Isles that didn't have a strategy. So that first conversation I had with her was like, let's really try to focus on the things where we do agree. And actually, in terms of the bandwidth that we have, in terms of the time that we have got left, even if we just focused on the things we agree with, we'll never get the time to do all of that. So that's what we've really tried to do week in and week out. Of course, things come along where there will be disagreements, and that is challenging. You know, I'm not naive. I know that there will, of course, be challenging times and difficult times ahead. But I do think as well, building that relationship, hopefully, that in the good times, you can really make progress and deliver. But in the tough times, hopefully, the robustness of that relationship provides the resilience that you're able to work your way through that and hopefully get to the other side.
Good, thank you. Speaking of relationship, Sharon, I was interested to turn to you to talk some about the U.S. relationship with Northern Ireland. As you know, the U.S. played a very important role in facilitating the peace process in Northern Ireland back in the 1990s. We've been very involved in supporting the implementation of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement ever since, and also encouraging the British government and the EU to arrive at a withdrawal agreement that did not disrupt the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. So what do you see as the role of the U.S. vis-a-vis Northern Ireland moving forward?
Thank you very much. It's great to be here today, and to be here also with you, Emma, to talk about how committed the United States is to Northern Ireland. As you noted, we were there at the beginning, really trying our best to play a positive facilitator role in coming to an agreement, and we're thrilled when that did come about and recognize the hard work that has to go into it. And the U.S. really has a strong bipartisan commitment to this, and you see that on Capitol Hill. You've seen it throughout our history with our special envoys coming from so many different parts of our country, and with this strong, strong commitment, this peace agreement and the dividends that it gives to the people of Northern Ireland and then to our country as well. And so that is one point that I would like to emphasize moving forward. We see the economic dividends of this as being, as you said, very much delivering for our people. And that is something that over time has progressed to deliver for the American people as well. So we have our historical ties in Northern Ireland, which are very strong. And we've seen that all of this week with the commitment of the Irish American community and connections. I myself have Irish American roots also. But now we're at a new and very positive level on the investment and the companies, both American companies investing in Northern Ireland, but now we're seeing many companies that are going the opposite direction. And that's what we want, investment and growth from a strong Northern Ireland economy that can then bring jobs and connections to the United States. And so we would want to see that continue. That has been traditionally the role in the last few years of our special envoy, growing the economy. It's very much the focus of this current U.S. administration, the Trump administration, is to deliver for the American people. And in that regard, it's both the economic deliverables and peace. And so as the Taoiseach said, and as many other prominent people have said, our vice president said very clearly in the last couple of days, this peace agreement is a model and a success. We have a lot of conflict going on in the world, and we want to deliver peace in those areas as well. And so we are invested in making sure that this peace agreement continues to be a model.
Thank you. I love how you were leading me all to my next question and every answer. So I would like to ask you about the special envoy. Recently, 36 members of Congress sent a letter to President Trump requesting the appointment of a new special envoy. Other Irish American groups have encouraged the creation of a special envoy with a broad remit, so not just economic, but also political. And they stress the importance of bedding down the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, supporting the implementation of parts of it that have not yet been implemented. How do you evaluate, assess the contribution of a special envoy, and would you encourage President Trump to appoint a new one?
We are waiting right now to hear from the White House if they have someone in mind for this position. It has strong support on the Hill, and so we'll see how that comes about and who it may or may not be. I would emphasize that a special envoy position is unique in its flexibility. And so, as you were saying, what would be the remit? Because it is special, and that being in the title, it can do many different things. And in that way, the position could respond to whatever the particular focus is or needs are at the time. The last special envoy spent a lot of time focused very much on economic investment and really strengthening long-term, very solid business connections between the United States and Northern Ireland. We've heard a lot about how there are growing specialties and real expertise in Northern Ireland on cybersecurity. That's an issue that we have a lot of interest and needs in, and we are promoting globally that any partner or ally of the United States has got to have strong cybersecurity. And so as a hub for that, Northern Ireland could really share that, do more for American companies and for our workforce as well. So that's a possibility. I'm not saying that that's what it's going to be, but I do think that a special envoy position should be poised to focus on the needs of the day and take advantage of where the strengths are on both sides.
Yeah, that makes good sense. Okay, thank you. Emma, Northern Ireland has long had an education system segregated by religion, and more than 90% of children today still attend segregated schools. The U.S. also struggles with schools that are segregated, although in our case by race, and sort of de facto segregated in some places. What are some of the challenges and successes your government has had in addressing this issue, and what do you think are the best ways to fix the problem?
Well, I think first of all, it's important to recognise that I think the Northern Ireland of today is so dramatically and significantly different, even from the Northern Ireland of just over 25 years ago. You know, a huge amount of work went into that Belfast Good Friday Agreement and the subsequent agreements to get us to this place. And of course, I want to recognise the huge, valuable work that the US did to support that process. But, you know, I believe that, you know, all of our young people now are largely much more integrated generally in terms of their friend groups and the diversity that we have in Northern Ireland. And of course, there is this organic integration as well that's happening within our schools. So I think there's a complexity around the situation that's not well understood, in that we have a state sector, we have an integrated sector, and we have a faith sector. And in Northern Ireland, it's very much at this stage about parental choice. And there will be those who choose to send their children to the faith sector in Northern Ireland. But the state sector is open to all. And very often the state sector, which has happened here, is rolled into that 90%. And many of those schools have a significant mix, equally as mixed as, for example, some of the integrated schools. But of course, we are very keen to support that greater understanding, that greater mixing right across young people, not just, of course, in those school settings, but in the community settings as well, and within their own communities that right across Northern Ireland that now look very different than what they would have looked like 25 years ago. So within my office, the executive office, where Michelle and I are ministers, we have our good relations strategy, which is called Together, Building a United Community. And that's very much what, for me, it's all about. It's about, you know, looking at that united community where people are confident and, you know, to not only be who they are and to express those views. I said before, several years ago when I was here, look, I'm a really proud unionist, but I'm also really proud of my identity and my culture. And it's not about myself, just look, that's what I like and I'm not going to. I think that confidence in people and communities to enable people to come together, to appreciate the identity and culture of others as well, but to do that in the space where everybody feels respected. And I think we're making good progress towards that. We're not there yet. But I see a large part of my role in this job to also try to give that sense of confidence, you know, to say to people, I am very confident with who I am, and part of the confidence in my identity within what had been a deeply divided society in Northern Ireland is being able to embrace and to look at and to listen and enjoy and to like the cultural identities and the sport and the expressions of another culture there. And we haven't always had that in Northern Ireland, and I think that's been the challenge. So that's very much something that I really want to cultivate in Northern Ireland. And I think that will really help that reconciliation, because confident people coming together with that social capital together, that then helps build those enduring and robust relationships across and within communities.
Makes good sense. Yeah, thank you. So another question to you, please. Northern Ireland is positioned in the immediate vicinity of the Irish Sea, the Baltic Sea, the English Channel, where underwater cables provide vital communication and other pipelines. There's growing concern about Russian interference with these cables. How should the U.S. and other nation states think about Northern Ireland in strategic terms?
Yeah, look, Northern Ireland is hugely strategic. I've bad news for the Irish government officials in the room. I asked President Trump to rename the Irish Sea the Northern Irish Sea, and he's seriously considering it. So I'm expecting an announcement any day now. But yeah, look, Northern Ireland is very strategically placed, particularly in relation to defence. We have a really strong aerospace and defence industries, and that connects into our cybersecurity. Northern Ireland, I believe, looking at it from a US perspective, we are close. I think somebody said, think of it as nearshoring, not offshoring, because we are so close. We are English speaking. We are in a reasonable time zone difference with the US, but we also are it's a place which is as high regulation. It has high quality employees. We're able to do things like cybersecurity and finance, the backup support services, not just in terms of companies, because of course companies now have equally as secure requirements as even government has, but particularly for government in terms of that really sensitive work. And Northern Ireland very much, to me, and I think that's the way I would present it, is a gateway to not just the United Kingdom and Ireland, but of course to the European Union as well. We're just a short jump across the pond, and I think that really provides good opportunities. But that link up in terms of defence, because Northern Ireland is part of the UK is part of NATO. Northern Ireland, per head of the population, contributes significantly more to the armed forces, for example, of the UK. But we also have a lot of that aerospace and defence technology and production in Northern Ireland. So in my view, Northern Ireland can be a really good friend to the US on defence matters, not just in terms of those aspects, but the cybersecurity and the global security, because we know that actually that's where a lot of those security threats are now going to come from. And Northern Ireland does a lot of work already with the US, with Israel, with other European Union countries, because of that really, really good cluster we have there.
If I could just add on a few words to that, because I think it's a really important topic that you've raised, and it was really good to hear you put it in the context, Emma, that with Northern Ireland being part of the UK and part of the NATO, UK being a leader along with the United States within the NATO context as well for a lot of the security threats going on right now. And so both on a bilateral basis and then through our NATO alliance, we are talking about all of these things. The cable cuts is a really big issue, whether it's underwater fiber optic cables or undersea pipelines as well that supply all of our energy. These are critical infrastructure elements that we have got to work together on to protect. Our national security, our economic security, all depends so heavily on it. And so that's yet another reason why this relationship has got to be strong and it's got to be solid.
And also the recognition, of course, in Northern Ireland that our airports and ports are a NATO ally, ports and airports as well. So that is also significant in terms of the defence of that Irish Sea and the sensitivities around all of that. But in addition, in terms of that base onwards into the wider European Union and beyond, I think there's a lot that we can do to play our part.
I always think of the ports in Londonderry and Derry and as a staging ground. Northern Ireland is a staging ground for the US and the Allies in World War II.
Yes, of course, and we played a huge role. That's why we have so many. We had a number of US based in Northern Ireland for that reason, because when they were flying over, it was the first stop, and it was the first Ally stop in terms of onwards into the campaign.
300,000 Americans were stationed there. So, Sharon, we've heard an awful lot about golf this week. And there's something coming up in this summer, perhaps. I understand that Northern Ireland will be hosting the British Open in Portrush, and that seems like it could be a very good occasion for American investors to connect with other business leaders around opportunities for economic development in and around Northern Ireland, particularly as Northern Ireland remains in the UK and the EU for trading purposes. So how is the State Department planning for this event, and what are you thinking about in terms of this occasion?
Sure. This is one example of why it is so positive for us to have a consulate and to have James, who's right there, working with American companies and taking advantage of unique opportunities. And so the British Open certainly is a unique opportunity, and we anticipate a lot of focus on the region. It will bring both popular media and tourism, but hopefully more business focus as well. And that's part of it, I would say, that's very important within the American context, is to raise the visibility of Northern Ireland and the visibility of what the opportunities are there and the current situation. So many Americans might not realize what it looks like today and what a great place it is to go and visit and to look at for setting up a foothold in the UK and the EU, truly unique. And so we'll be looking to do that sort of thing as well. But I would highlight that that's just an example of how we try to promote the ties using a lot of other unique opportunities. The growth of the creative industries recently is another. And so bringing into people's living rooms, whether it's Dairy Girls or other cultural iconic programs at this point, it is a way to promote the relationship that is very effective. And so working on that as well.
Great. So now I have a question that's sort of two-pronged, part of it for each of you, and then we'll turn it over to some questions from the floor. So first, Emma, you mentioned being a proud unionist, a strong supporter of Northern Ireland remaining part of the United Kingdom. The Belfast Good Friday Agreement envisions a vote on Northern Ireland's constitutional future at some point when there's a chance it might succeed. As a unionist, how do you view that clause? And do you think a vote will happen in the next 10 years, as some suggest? What concerns you about a potential border poll?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I suppose, in the office of First Minister and Deputy First Minister, I think it's fair to me to say, of course we have very, very different views on this. And again, right from the outset, we've just said, of course we do. We shouldn't have to struggle with what the joint line or an agreed line on is. I think the best thing to do is just to be absolutely open. I've got my personal views about this. Michelle has her views about that. In terms of the provision within the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, for me, it is not a destination. It is not an inevitability that there will be one. Indeed, as a unionist, my job with my more party political hat on is to ensure that more people are content within Northern Ireland in the United Kingdom. And I believe that happy, thriving people within Northern Ireland will not agitate for that constitutional change. And that's why I really want Northern Ireland to work. I really want people to have those really fulfilled and thriving lives as part of that. But of course, that's because I really genuinely believe that Northern Ireland's place is much better within that United Kingdom. The UK, as we've just seen in recent weeks, is a global player. It has a role on the global stage. It's a significant economy, the sixth largest economy in the world. It has broad shoulders in difficult times, but it also provides huge opportunity for us as well in good times. So, I am a committed unionist, and for me, it is to try to ensure that the conditions are never anywhere close to those meeting the test that has been set down there. I know for some others, nationalists and Republicans in Northern Ireland, they see this as the destination. They want to get to this point and then beyond that to have a rolling series of this. But I do assure my unionist supporters that that is not. The provision is there. Of course it is there because it emphasises the consent principle. And we always should remember that when Northern Ireland was created, it was created by the democratic will of the people. It was very clear that the vast majority of those people in that part of the island of Ireland did not want to leave the United Kingdom along with the rest of the island of Ireland. And indeed, there was a vote for that purpose. A lot of people don't realise this, of course, that when this happened, the provision was that the entire 32 counties could leave unless there was a vote by those in what was the 6 counties, the Northern Ireland area, not to follow the rest of Ireland to leave. And they did that vote and decided to stay within the United Kingdom and not leave at that time. So, of course, it's there. But I would say this, some might say, I don't think that it is a useful thing for us to overly focus on that particular issue, because we have so much to get on with in Northern Ireland, because the reality is, regardless of your constitutional position, if you're on a health waiting list and you're in pain, if you can't get a good job for your children, if people can't buy or get an affordable house for themselves, like all of these things impact significantly on the quality of people's lives. And I would always say, regardless of the constitutional position, you know, we need to be delivering for people. We need to be making sure that every person in Northern Ireland, no matter where you are in Northern Ireland, that you're able to live the very best life that you possibly can, and that your public services are working for you as well. So that's very much what I'm going to focus on in the next number of years as well. And as I've said, there's so much of that to get on with. You said, what are my concerns about a border poll? I do think that if we keep getting dragged into that discussion, then everything becomes divided again into, you know, you have to pick a side. And for a lot of people that I meet in Northern Ireland, yes, there's strong unionists, there's strong Republican nationalists, but there's a lot of people in Northern Ireland that just want to get on with life. And they want just the things to work. They want to focus on the issues that really matter to them day in and day out. And I think if there is a border poll, you know, the entire sort of prism of what we are doing starts to it gets filtered through this idea of you need to pick one side or the other. What side are you coming down on? We've just had I don't know how long ago it's now, the Brexit vote. And, you know, there's no doubt about that. Like, I think everybody looking at that could see it was, no matter where you were in that debate, it was divisive. People had to take a position on it. But the aftermath of that was significant as well. It has taken us a long, long time, I think, in the UK to try to mend a little bit of those deep divisions that happened around that time, and the toxic nature of a lot of that debate as well at that time.
So Sharon, on this theme of a border poll, we've been talking about the U.S. role in promoting the peace process and the implementation of the peace process. How might the U.S. play a positive role in the context of these issues of a potential border poll?
We feel this is very much a question for the people of Northern Ireland, and we've been very clear on that. It's ultimately, peace agreement and a positive future relies on the people that are there, the citizens and the neighbors who have to work through these issues, and it really is for them to decide.
Yeah, great. Okay, so according to my watch, if I borrow back a few minutes, we're supposed to end at exactly 11:30, so the Secretary of State can have his time. That gives us 11 minutes to take questions from the audience. I am supposed to emphasize any student who wants to ask a question. So Luke, I'm looking at you.
There's someone over there.
Sorry. Yep. Hi, there are mics here and here if you would like to approach one. Or perhaps, actually, could we bring one to him? It'd be hard to get there, I think.
Hello. I have a question for Deputy First Minister Pindelli. What is your opinion on the sort of truth and reconciliation efforts by the United Kingdom and Ireland and your party regarding investigations into the murders of the Troubles, and how can this historical memory be done correctly and to properly assess the responsibility of all sides during the Troubles in terms of the violence?
Emma, before you begin, may I please mention, I'm going to pitch that Chief Constable John Boucher will be speaking this afternoon right after lunch from 1:15 to 2:15, and I think he has a few thoughts on this as well. So thank you, Emma.
Yeah. Look, it's been hugely challenging. Too many people, but many, many people in Northern Ireland have never had justice for their loved one who was murdered or if they've been injured in the violence of the Troubles. And, we haven't been able to find a good solution to that. My political party and my party political position on it is that we are completely opposed to amnesty. We just don't believe that that is the right direction in terms of justice and the principles of justice and making sure that no matter how unlikely it may be that somebody will get justice, we believe that everybody should still have the opportunity to get that. So if something happens, new evidence comes forward, whatever that looks like. Some of the challenges that we have, of course, is that many of these murders were a significant period of time ago. And at that time, in terms of forensics, in terms of the retention of that evidence, the cross-contamination within that evidence, and I know that John will be able to speak much more to this. I am a lawyer and I come from that background, so I recognise the challenges that there are there in terms of getting that justice. But of course, technologies have moved on and we don't know where we're going to be in 5 years' time in terms of what we're able to do around some of that crime scene evidence from the time. Look at how much DNA has moved on over that period of time. And there's still the hope that some of that may be able to bring some justice to people. When I speak to victims and survivors of the Troubles and of the conflict in Northern Ireland, I think they are very realistic as well. They want the opportunity of justice, but they know it's going to be very, very tough, but they don't want to see amnesty. So look, it's hugely difficult. To me, this has to be a victim and survivor-led process. We need to listen to them. It's not up to me as a politician to be imposing my thoughts onto them, and I've always been very conscious about that. We do have a new set of arrangements. You will be aware, or some will be aware, the legacy legislation was controversial. It wasn't universally wanted, desired, liked by victims and survivors, never mind the political parties. So I think we're still struggling with this one. I think it's the greatest probably flaw, mistake of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement and subsequent agreements that more wasn't done about this particular issue at the time. But I really do feel for those people who are still either suffering in pain today because of their injuries or still grieving the loss of their loved one and they haven't had justice. So I think whatever the structure looks like, we're giving this ICI or the new bodies that have been set up the opportunity to see what they will do. But I think there's a lot of concern that it may not get victims and survivors the justice that they really want to see and the outcome that they really want, the truth that they want and need to see as well.
So victim-centered.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Questions? Oh, Luke? I'm sorry, Luke was a former student in my Northern Ireland class.
Hi. First off, thank you all for this wonderful talk. I'm curious about, as more and more Northern Irish people opt out of the unionist and nationalist identification, as you put it, more and more people are just looking to get on with their lives. I'm curious about the future of the political institutions in Northern Ireland, whether they will need to adapt to that change. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, look, and this is a live discussion at the moment. We have a number of different parties, including some of those parties in the centre, which don't want to designate or don't designate as either unionist or nationalist. There were some changes in the St Andrews Agreement, for example, that happened in 2006, and that led to the restoration of the institutions in 2007. And within that, there were some changes that effectively means that the second largest designation or the first largest designation, that doesn't have to be nationalist or unionist. That can be what's designated as other as well, and that facilitates the option of that grouping being the Deputy First Minister or the First Minister as well, if they overtake either one of those groups. So it's more nuanced than I think some people think, that they think that this is simply just a nationalist and unionist, and that's embedded within it. But our structure of government is undoubtedly very challenging. But I always say this, that people often talk about closed room thinking and the negatives about all of that. But the reality is, You do need disruptors at times, so maybe not quite as disruptive as some might have seen in recent times, but you do need disruptors. You need people to be questioning, what people are doing. And in Northern Ireland, because of our unique setup, we've got inbuilt challenge functions because, if I'm sitting in the executive with my particular view, I have to navigate that through Mike and the Ulster Unionist Party, for Sinn Féin, the Alliance Party, they're in there as well. And, they legitimately ask questions, as I do, of their policies. And actually, I think if we do this right, that actually potentially results in better decision making, better policies, because we're getting a range of perspectives from right across the political spectrum. But we also have that inbuilt disruptor with that inbuilt challenge function to break down our closed room thinking. So, I've often, I said right at the beginning this time last year that actually, that difference, which has always been seen as a challenge to overcome in Northern Ireland, that actually that difference in diversity could be our superpower in Northern Ireland, because actually that maybe will lead us to a position where we get those great ideas, better policies, good policy decision making and development. So that's the aspiration. Some people may say it's a little naive, but I do think we will get there. And I think with everybody really pushing in the same direction, and really wanting this place of Northern Ireland to work, then I think we really can get there on the big issues that really matter for people. And those issues at the moment are the non-constitutional. It's how we fix our health service, how do we make education work, how do we tackle educational underachievement, how do we grow our economy, how do we in Northern Ireland become the best open, small, agile economy in the world. And that's the big aspiration that we have.
That's great. I think I see a question here. And then in the back.
Yes, hi. My question is, I guess, toward the economics and the separation from the EU. And the last time we met, that border issue and crossing goods and so forth was a big one. How smoothly is that working, and what rough edges remain?
Okay, well, look, there are still challenges that remain, and I think the vast majority of the issues where there's friction, particularly between GB and NI within the UK single market for goods, has really been unexpected things, unanticipated things. At the moment, the UK centrally have not diverged in any of the regulations from the European Union. So at the moment, they are exactly the same standards. There's no issue with that, but there has to be a process because UK GB is outside of the European Union single market, and NI UK is within it. So that is a challenge, there's no doubt, and we are continuing to work with the UK government to try to address some of those issues. The vast majority of our foreign direct investment and our growth is in services. So the Windsor framework arising from the protocol is only goods related. However, it does have an impact. We've just seen this week around the tariff, the potential tariff war between the EU and the USA. That creates complications for Northern Ireland. So Northern Ireland is within the UK Customs Union. So for the purposes of our exports, they are UK exports. So there's no issue in terms of that. So if President Trump puts tariffs on, those tariffs are going to hit EU, it's going to hit the Republic of Ireland, but Northern Ireland exports are UK. However, because Northern Ireland operates the rules of the European Union Customs Union, if the European Union then decides to put tariffs on, there is a complication. So there's a complication with imports. So this week I have been going about everywhere to try to make sure everybody is aware of this complexity, because I am very conscious when we look at the problems, the particular issues with friction so far, it hasn't been for something that has been targeted towards Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has been kind of caught in the crossfire in terms of other issues because, much as I absolutely love Northern Ireland, I'd love to be a champion for Northern Ireland, I am also aware that Northern Ireland is not always at the top of the agenda when people are looking at these other issues. So that's why, this week I've been trying to do my best to make sure people are aware that, if you're discussing this issue, there is an issue for us. And that can be dealt with if indeed people are aware of it, those people in the room making these decisions to do the carve out or to put the condition on that. This one will largely be on the European Union side, I have to say, because it is imports rather than exports that are impacted by this. So look, it's just a good example of a big global issue where Northern Ireland isn't really involved in it, but because of this, there is a risk that we're caught up. And, so these issues pop up, things that would never have been envisaged, a number of years ago when these arrangements were set down. And we do feel that this will continue to be the case. But again, I do think, and I always emphasise this, there's a huge number of advantages that Northern Ireland has as an economy. I said about us having a young population, that's a well-educated population. We've got a thriving business community, in my view, in all the right areas in terms of future-proofing that. The creative industries is a big one. But we also have those unique aspects, such as the Gulf coming up. And even when I was speaking to President Trump, and by the way, that was a joke about me saying about that. Nobody report that. If anybody's going to, if I see this in the Belfast Telegraph, but whenever I was speaking to him, it was, he knew so much about Northern Ireland from the Gulf and knowing about the Gulf here. So coming up to the Open in Northern Ireland, not only will it showcase our absolutely amazing North Coast and hopefully the tourism and other aspects of that, but it's also an opportunity for people to say, Northern Ireland, what's that all about? And for us to be able to use all of our agencies and our messaging and to invite key people over, because I think that, as I said yesterday morning, in a global investment environment, it's not just about the prioritization of key areas. We need to have that uniqueness. What is our USP out there that makes people go, well, why would I choose Northern Ireland over, whatever other place that may be? So I think we do have it. I think we have it in buckets, and I think there's a huge opportunity for Northern Ireland. But I say many times, opportunity is opportunity. You only realise opportunity if you seize it. And I think that's why I'm here this week. That's why the Northern Ireland Executive is really pulling together on this, because we really want to grow our economy. We want to supercharge our economy because we know that is the best way to ensure stability, because happy, thriving people do not agitate for big revolutionary change and a change of circumstances, changes of governments that creates that instability.
Thank you so very much. I know I promised that young man in the back, perhaps you can catch us at a comfort break or at lunch, and we'll let you ask your question then. But I am getting signals that we need to hand the stage over to our next speaker, who's the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. But before we do that, please allow me to thank you, Sharon, so very much. And Emma, great job.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen, we have an embarrassment of riches today, because we have not only had the Deputy First Minister and the Deputy Secretary of State, but we've also got the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Hilary Benn, here. My name is Duncan Morrow. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Ulster University, and this is a real opportunity for us to demonstrate, actually, I think, just how conversation is important to both making clear some of the issues in Northern Ireland, but also giving an opportunity for people to really engage with those things here today. So we're very proud to be part of this partnership. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dara Gannon, who's been absolutely at the core of the organising, and he'll take you for the rest of this session.
Thank you, Duncan. As I stand here today, I realise how tall all of my colleagues are. I'll move this microphone down. Thank you for the kind introduction. As the resident historian at the Global Irish Studies Initiative at Georgetown University, I hope you'll indulge me as I begin my introductory remarks, not in the 21st century, but in the early 20th century. On the 9th of December 1919, the Member of Parliament for Leith, Scotland, rose to the floor of the House of Commons. I feel very strongly about the state of Ireland, he proclaimed passionately. It is a very important and a very painful subject. I wish I could have had the honour of addressing the minister who is responsible, or largely responsible, for the state of things in that country. The MP who delivered that poignant address was none other than Captain William Wedgwood Benn, a decorated First World War British Army officer, an outstanding orator, and the grandfather of our next speaker. So it is my great honour to introduce to you the British Minister or Secretary of State today in the 21st century, who is today responsible, or largely responsible, to paraphrase his grandfather, for the state of things in Northern Ireland.
No pressure there.
Yes, your grandfather gave you an out on that one. So, A member of the Labour Party, the Right Honourable Hilary Benn, has been elected as the Member of Parliament for Leeds South and/or Leeds Central since 1999. And during the last Labour government, he served successively as Secretary of State for International Development and Secretary of State for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. From 2016 to 2021, he served as the British House of Commons Chair of the Select Committee on the Future Relationship with the European Union. And in July of 2024, just last year, Hilary Benn was appointed Secretary of State for Northern Ireland by British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure and privilege to invite the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Sir Hilary Benn, to address the Washington Forum on Northern Ireland. Thank you, Dara.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Dara, for that warm introduction. Thank you for inviting me to join you here today. It's a great pleasure to be here in this wonderful partnership between Georgetown University, the American University, and Ulster University. And one's not allowed to say the words Ulster University. Yes, I know, you know what's coming, without also pointing out the 2024 University of the Year. And I think you'll be dining out on that for quite some time to come. It's also a great pleasure to be back here in Washington for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations a year on from the restoration of the Northern Ireland Executive. You've just been listening to Emma Little-Pengelly, and she, together with the First Minister, Michelle O'Neill, were the stars of the show 12 months ago. And I say to you today that 12 months on, the executive they lead, and indeed Northern Ireland itself, have made really good progress. And we have, of course, in that intervening period, seen the election of new governments in the United States, in Ireland, and in July last year in the United Kingdom, when after 14 years of Conservative government, people right across the United Kingdom voted for change, and that is what the Labour government, led by Sir Keir Starmer, is working hard to bring about. And it was an enormous honour on the 5th of July to be appointed by the Prime Minister as the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. I must say the responsibility weighs heavily, not least because of what was achieved by the last Labour government, in which I had the privilege to serve. A couple of weeks after his great election victory in 1997, Tony Blair was in Belfast. It was his first official visit as Prime Minister outside London. And he said this: "Our destination is clear, to see in place a fair political settlement in Northern Ireland, one that lasts because it is based on the will and consent of the people here. The time is right, finally, to put the past behind us and meet the deep thirst of the people of Northern Ireland for peace, normality, and prosperity." And a little under 11 months later, that thirst was quenched when on that miraculous Good Friday, peace, normality, and prosperity finally appeared to be within reach. The Good Friday Agreement was, in my opinion, the government's greatest achievement. It was something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I don't know about you, but I did, we did, and it was forged above all by courageous political leadership, a lesson for conflicts around the world today. And in the 27 years since, Northern Ireland has undergone the most remarkable transformation. Today, the UK and Irish governments, co-guarantors and custodians of what was achieved on that Friday, and the United States was, of course, such an important partner in the peace process, in the negotiation of the Good Friday Agreement, just as the United States remains an indispensable partner of the United Kingdom today. The diplomacy and the determination of President Bill Clinton, and in particular of Senator George Mitchell, with whom I had the privilege to sit next to at dinner at a wonderful event at Queen's about 2 or 3 months ago. They were instrumental in persuading all of those who were involved in the negotiations to take the steps that eventually each and every one of them took. Courage and compromise. That is what ultimately forged the peace. And on the day the agreement was signed, President Clinton said very eloquently, "The parties have made brave decisions. They have chosen hope over hate. the promise of the future over the poison of the past. And in so doing, already, they have written a new chapter in the rich history of their island, a chapter of resolute courage that inspires us all. And I believe that the Good Friday Agreement to this day remains an inspiration to so many people around the world, because it is proof, living, breathing proof of what can be achieved by courage and patient diplomacy, which triumphs over bitter sectarian hatred. Now, power sharing isn't easy. I mean, if you imagine for a moment, either in Washington or in Westminster, the two main parties having to be in permanent mandatory coalition with people with whom they fundamentally disagree. And devolved government in Northern Ireland has not always been straightforward. Indeed, since 1998, the people of Northern Ireland have been without an executive for more than a third of the time. Now, that makes it all the more important that the current executive endures, and I must say I have been really impressed by how the executive is working constructively together to seek to balance the books, to improve public services, and to implement their programme for government that was agreed recently. Now, there is a great deal to be done, not least to stabilise and transform the health service, and that is something that the executive is committed to in its programme for government. And I think at this point in time, as I reflect upon it, after all of the events of recent years, Northern Ireland has that most valuable of things, stability. Stability. And I believe the conditions are now in place for the executive, indeed for the people of Northern Ireland, to grasp the opportunities that beckon. The largest budget settlement since devolution, a funding formula that reflects Northern Ireland's level of need relative to the rest of the United Kingdom. Certainty after all of the uncertainty that was created by the result of the EU referendum in 2016 about Northern Ireland's place in the UK internal market. Advantageous trading arrangements through the Windsor framework, which we are implementing. Remember, Northern Ireland has access both to the European market and to the UK market. What a place to come and invest, while at the same time seeking closer trading relationships both with the European Union and with the United States of America. And I hope that the executive, the parties in Northern Ireland, the people of Northern Ireland feel that in this UK government, they have a partner that is committed to working together with them to generate investment, growth, improve public services, while always, of course, respecting the devolution settlement. Because this is a government that is determined to invest right across the United Kingdom. We have our new industrial strategy, we have our National Wealth Fund, we have the 4 city deals in Northern Ireland that offer so much promise. As we confront the climate crisis and seize the opportunity that net zero represents for all of us, we are committed as a government to making the UK a clean energy superpower with Great British Energy, a public-owned company, at its heart. And all of this provides a platform for inward investment and prosperity. And Northern Ireland has so many other strengths, fantastic universities, a cost-competitive business environment, a well-educated workforce, and the great expertise and advocacy of Invest NI. And there is so much potential in Northern Ireland. And it is wonderful to see the confidence that so many firms from the United States of America have placed and continue to place in Northern Ireland's future. In the last decade, US investment in Northern Ireland has been worth about £1.5 billion and created around 13,000 jobs. Some examples: the cyber security sector. Now, cyber security is increasingly important in the modern age, and Northern Ireland is the #1 global destination for US foreign direct investment in cybersecurity. I learned that a little while ago. I was not aware of it before, so we need to spread the word. An example: Rapid7, set up in Belfast just over a decade ago, drawn there by Northern Ireland's unique and globally recognised cybersecurity ecosystem, if you want to use that word, and its talent and breadth of academic research and development. In fintech, for which Belfast is now globally renowned, Chicago-based Spider Technology made its first investment in January this year. It's establishing a new engineering development base in Belfast, which will be critical to developing their trading platform and enabling expansion into European markets. Many other examples, Almac in Craigavon, Seagate in Derry, Londonderry. Also other developments in advanced manufacturing. We're going to see the return of shipbuilding to Harland and Wolff. Now that's a big moment, a very big moment, with the production of the 3 Fleet Solid Support ships, a partnership between Harland and Wolff and Navantia. The recent announcement that Thales is going to build more missiles for Ukraine, underwritten by UK export finance, so Ukraine has the means to defend itself in the current conflict, and in the peace we hope will be able to be reached. And there is enormous interest in the creative industries, which has seen Northern Ireland develop this burgeoning TV and film industry, offering both incredible natural beauty and gritty realism that is to be found in shows including Game of Thrones, The Fall, Line of Duty, and Derry Girls. And I made a speech in the House of Commons on the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, in which I said everybody should watch the final episode of Derry Girls about the Good Friday Agreement. When I watched it, I wept, openly wept, because it embodied the hope and the peace that that moment of the referendum brought. Absolutely a brilliant television. And very soon we're going to see the opening of Studio Ulster, which is a groundbreaking new virtual production studio with Hollywood-grade facilities right in the heart of Belfast. And it's quite something, because you can film in the desert in the morning with a backdrop. I mean, backdrop, that's the old-fashioned word. It's really high-tech. And in the afternoon, you can be in Antarctica, and you can change the sets really quickly. You don't have to go to the desert, and you don't have to go to Antarctica. What an encouragement to people to come and produce more films in Belfast. And so for all of these reasons, and many, many, many more, I'm confident that the years ahead will bring further investment from these shores and from countries around the world. And the trade flows both ways. The United States remains Northern Ireland's second largest export market, with some 1.9 billion worth of goods and services exported to the US in 2022. And we hope that more is to come following the Prime Minister and the President's agreement to work towards a new economic deal, because we want to strengthen and deepen the trading relationships between our two countries. And now, as well as resetting the relationship between the UK government and the Northern Ireland Executive, the new UK government has set about resetting the relationship with the Irish government. After, well, let's be honest, a relationship that has been sorely tested in recent years. And it is a true transformation since July. Last summer, the Prime Minister and the then Taoiseach Simon Harris agreed to hold annual summits. The first of those was in Liverpool a couple of weeks ago. I was there along with Cabinet colleagues, the Prime Minister, the Taoiseach, Michael Martin, Simon Harris, and other ministers from the Irish government. And we agreed an ambitious programme of cooperation between our two countries in areas including trade and investment, foreign and security policy, energy, transition to net zero, development of artificial intelligence, digital technology, and strengthening the deep ties between our people and cultures, not least through joint hosting of the Euro 2028 Men's Football Championship and the 2030 T20 Men's Cricket Cup. I was a bit worried about saying that, because if I'd said T30 Men's Cricket World Cup, I would have invented a new form of the game. But I got it right. And underpinning all of this cooperation is a shared ambition for a more reconciled, peaceful and prosperous Northern Ireland. Now, I just want to say this about the legacy of the Troubles, which still weighs heavily on the families who lost loved ones due to the savagely brutal violence of the Troubles, not least on those who are still searching all these years later for answers about what happened to their loved ones. And the unilateral approach taken by the previous government in the form of the Legacy Act was wrong. We opposed it. In opposition, we made clear our commitment to repeal and replace it. Last December, I started the process with secondary legislation to repeal the conditional immunity scheme, bring back civil cases, which have been found by the courts to be unlawful, incompatible with the European Convention. And I have committed, when parliamentary time allows, to introduce primary legislation to replace the Legacy Act, the details of which I am in discussion about with many, many people, including the Taoiseach. acknowledging and addressing the suffering of the victims and survivors of the Troubles was one of the aims of the Good Friday Agreement. And it falls to us now, this generation, to make good on that promise. And I am absolutely determined to ensure that for all those who are still seeking answers, who have experienced such pain and trauma and suffering, that there is a system in place for investigations and truth recovery that all communities can have confidence in. There is also another issue on which we need to make progress, and that is to seek to end the scourge of paramilitarism in Northern Ireland, once and for all. Now, it was never justified in the past, and it's unacceptable. In 2025, around 40% of adults and young people report that they are affected by paramilitarism. Now, what do they mean by that? They mean criminality, coercion, punishment beatings, sexual exploitation, and grooming of young people. That's what it's about. Now, the Executive and the Police Service of Northern Ireland are doing absolutely vital work to try and combat this, including trying to bring to justice those engaging in criminality. But in support of these efforts, and in line with the recommendation of the Independent Reporting Commission, which is a joint UK-Irish government body, we will soon appoint an independent person to explore whether there is merit in establishing a process to try and support paramilitary disbandment. There are those in Northern Ireland who say they should have left the stage 25 years ago. I agree. The problem is they haven't. And I think we should try everything that may be able to enable us to make progress. Now, the final thing I wanted to say before we get into discussion is, self-evidently, the world today is very different to the world of 1998 when the Good Friday Agreement was signed. We're living through extraordinary times. We are having to deal with an increasingly volatile world. And now I was having a discussion with my team whether it's Heraclitus or Heraclitus, and the academics in the audience will be able to give me the right answer. He was absolutely on it 2,500 years ago when he observed that the only constant thing in life is change. And each generation learns and relearns that fundamental truth. There are more live conflicts around the world today than at any time since 1945. And never before, I think, have events taking place beyond our shores been felt so immediately at home. Indeed, I think we're living in an age now where the distinction of the past between the domestic and the international is becoming less and less clear, because the truth about the human condition at the beginning of the 21st century is that we are more interdependent than we have ever been before. You know, by the time my grandchildren reach my age, they will probably be sharing this planet with 10 billion human beings. And our future is bound together. Even though we may not have met them, we don't know their names, we are bound together on the one planet that we share. And security threats, old and new, are all around us. And that's why the Prime Minister recently committed to increase the UK's defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027, with the ambition to reach 3% in the next Parliament, as economic and fiscal conditions allow. And we face these shared challenges, and as we do so, the ties that for so long have bound our three countries together, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Ireland, will stand us in very good stead, because ours is a shared story. I was reflecting at the British Embassy event this morning that this gathering in Washington every week to celebrate St. Patrick's Day is the product of, and a story about, and conversations concerning migration. That's how we all got here, wherever we ended up. And it runs like a thread through just about every family, including my own, because it was an Ulster Scot from Fermanagh, my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Graydon, who made that journey that millions made across the Atlantic to the United States, to Ohio, from where my mother came when she agreed to marry my father in 1948, and on my wife's side, Irish Catholics from Cork and Mayo and Kilkenny. And I feel the echoes of the lives of those forebears as I go about my job. And while there is so much that is uncertain, there are a lot of reasons to feel positive about the future, because I believe that Northern Ireland has most of what it needs to be a success and to be a beacon of hope to the world by showing that peace is truly the foundation on which progress is built. And so it falls to all of us to ensure that that remains the case in Northern Ireland and beyond. Thank you very much. Okay. Can I sit?
Sure.
Oh, are you going to sit here?
Here
okay, you come and sit here.
Yeah,
right.
Absolutely. Thank you, Secretary of State, for those very thoughtful and thought-provoking remarks. So I should say to begin with, welcome to the Washington Forum.
Thank you.
This is, as we've heard earlier in the week, one of the integral parts of St. Patrick's Week in which we have hopefully the opportunity moving forward to have these long-form conversations and discussions about policy issues and giving policy practitioners space and time to reflect with colleagues on the issues of moment. I'd like to begin with the address that you gave at Ulster University just over a month ago on the 4th of February. And I'm just struck by a quote that you offered. After too many years in which Northern Ireland was too often treated by the previous government as an afterthought, this executive has a partner in the UK government. For our audience today, would you care to expand upon that idea of partnership as opposed to the previous government?
Well, in legacy, which I've talked about, the last government's Legacy Act managed to do something that rarely happens, united all of the parties in Northern Ireland against it. And that is going some if you do that, firstly. Secondly, in the wake of the Brexit referendum result, not a lot of thought, indeed precious little thought, had been given by those who argued that we should leave the European Union. I didn't. I campaigned passionately for Remain, about how you're going to deal with the consequences. And I think it stands as an object lesson when you're considering major constitutional changes. What does the result that represents change look like? And in the case of Northern Ireland, many people pointed out, we considered it in the Brexit Select Committee I had the privilege to chair, you'd have the United Kingdom and you'd have the European Union. And you'd have one set of rules for trade, one set of standards, and another set of rules and standards. But the border between the two entities doesn't exist. It's an open border. Question, it's an obvious question, how are you going to manage trade? It's unique. It happens nowhere else in the world. And there had to be a means, unless you were going to be irresponsible and say, we'll just look after our stuff, and what you do, European Union, well, that's your lookout. And that would have been a terrible thing to do. You have to find a means of ensuring that goods that come into the United Kingdom from the EU meet whatever our standards are at that time, and vice versa, that goods going into the European Union do the same. And now the Northern Ireland Protocol was the first go at that. Personally, I think the EU said to the UK, so where's the border going to be? Right, it's going to be in the Irish Sea. Here's the rule book. Off you go. Well, it was never going to work. Really important. It was never going to work. The EU was slightly surprised when passionate Remainers said to them, I said to Maros Sefcovic, it's not going to work, you know. It's not going to work practically, because every night supermarket lorries come from Cairnryan to Belfast and Larne to stock up the shops in Northern Ireland so that stuff is on the shelves when they open at 8:30 or 9 in the morning. Are you really going to ask for an export health certificate for every single one of the relevant items in the back of the lorry at enormous cost? Well, no. When the goods, well, they're staying in Northern Ireland, apart from people who cross the border to come and do their shopping, which people do, back and forth, back and forth. And secondly, the political consequences for Northern Ireland, for political stability, would have been very adverse. And out of that came, and credit to Rishi Sunak for negotiating the Windsor Framework and the EU, and that did represent an improvement. And the other thing that the previous government had been very, very careless about was having signed the deal that set up the Northern Ireland Protocol, and then set about trying to trash it. And the damage that did to the United Kingdom's reputation in the world, because people would look at the United Kingdom before and say, well, you know, with the UK, they sign a deal, they keep their word. Having trust, trust in international relations is absolutely fundamental to the building of relationships. And that government demonstrated, well, we may have signed on the bottom line, but we're not doing it. And that is why we have to make sure that we implement the Windsor Framework, not least because we want to negotiate a new deal with the EU. But as I say to those who are concerned about the Windsor Framework in Northern Ireland, if we don't honour the last deal we signed, why exactly would the European Union agree to sign a new deal with us? So it was a very bad period, but the past is now behind us, and I think we are in a better place.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. And you mentioned some of the words of trade. You mentioned earlier this idea of courage in diplomacy, which I thought was fascinating. I'm legally obliged to ask you about the question of the hour in terms of diplomacy, and I'm speaking specifically about whiskey diplomacy, if you'll indulge me. President Trump has threatened a 200% tariff on all alcohol coming from the European Union. For our audience today, could you speak to what you see Northern Ireland's position in relation to that question and how much it's going to cost them to purchase a bottle of Bushmills from Washington, D.C.?
Well, now at this stage, I have to confess, you're talking to a teetotaler. So, my grandfather, who you kindly referenced, he used to joke that when teetotalers gathered, one of their favourite songs was "The Good Ship Temperance is heading for the port." Yeah, which I think was quite funny. Look, any tariffs that the United States of America imposes on the European Union, Northern Ireland is part of the UK and the UK's customs territory. Where it becomes an issue for Northern Ireland, now the steel and aluminium tariffs, disappointingly, the Americans have chosen to impose right around the world, affect Northern Ireland and GB on an equal basis. So Northern Ireland is not more disadvantaged than the rest of the United Kingdom. The issue arises when the European Union decides to put countervailing tariffs on American products. Because at that moment, when goods come into Northern Ireland because it is part of the single market world, because that's the answer to the problem, two systems, no border, how do we handle trade, then those importing those goods have to pay the tariff, but there is a tariff reimbursement scheme, which is already in place in Northern Ireland. And the importer will have to demonstrate that the goods that they bought are not on their way to the Republic, or France, or Germany, or Greece, because if there wasn't confidence that was the case, the fear would be that everybody would route stuff through Northern Ireland to try and get round the countervailing tariffs. But once they've done that, then they get the money back. Now, it is bureaucracy, but it does mean that there is a mechanism to ensure that businesses in Northern Ireland are not eventually going to be out of pocket as a result of that. Look, a world in which industries are looking at tariff, counter-tariff, and so on and so forth is not a wonderful thing, and we need, through dialogue, to find a way forward.
That's very hopeful and optimistic, and I think we need to hear those kind of words today and going forward, for that matter. Now, in your remarks, you very carefully and correctly noted the importance of the United States to the ongoing peace process, and President Clinton and Senator Mitchell in particular. I'm mindful, looking as I survey the room, of many others in this room who were involved, past and present, right, in maintaining that peace process, most notably members of the ad hoc committee to protect the Good Friday Agreement. What role do you see for Irish America specifically going forward in maintaining that peace process in Northern Ireland?
Well, there is such a deep love for and interest in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland here in the United States of America, precisely because of that story of migration. And people know from whence they come. And the role that America played was very significant. And I sat next to Senator George Mitchell and spoke in warm and thankful terms about what he'd done. And when I came back down from the rostrum and sat next to him, he said, "That's very kind of you to say that. But you know, it wasn't me, it was the parties. Because in the end, they took the step." And I think the lesson from it, you can have all of the international support and encouragement, and that is hugely important. But if the parties to the conflict do not want peace, then it is not going to happen. And that's why I used the phrase, deliberately, courageous political leadership, because it may seem strange, but in some way, if you just remain in where you are, saying, "I'm the victim, you are the oppressor," and then you go around the other side of the table and they say, no, I'm the victim, you're my oppressor. You can stay there, you can say that forever. But it's the point at which you realize there's only one way forward if we're going to bring the killing and the slaughter and the bitterness and the hatred to an end, and that is to compromise in the interests of learning to live alongside each other in what is a small place. And those who were prepared to take that step did have to demonstrate a lot of courage, but Northern Ireland today is the beneficiary of what they have done. And the American interest continues to this day in inquiring how's it all going, but also in the investment that I talked about. And that too is a sign of this really deep relationship between the United States of America, the Republic of Ireland, and of course Northern Ireland, as American companies have come, they look, see, believe, invest, the phrase that I use, and then they reinvest, and then other people come and say, "Well, now what's going on in Northern Ireland? This looks rather good." And I would say of the executive, the single most important contribution the executive can make to future investment in Northern Ireland is to stay in place. Because you will talk to investors who will say, Northern Ireland, fabulous place, access to the two markets, great. But isn't that where the government disappears from time to time? Mm-hmm. So if you want to what do investors want? Stability. That's what they will always say. We want stability. We want to know what the rules, the conditions are. And that is the contribution that they can make. And I believe that this group of politicians and this executive absolutely understands that, because collapse in the past has served the people of Northern Ireland so badly. And when you stand for elected office, whoever you are, wherever you are, we take on the responsibility. And there may be mornings where you don't quite fancy it, or the circumstances are not as you would wish. But you can't walk out. You've got to carry on doing your job. And that is the biggest contribution that they can make themselves.
That's very encouraging and very empowering indeed for many of those who are in the audience. We're going to open the floor to questions from the audience now. So we have two roving mics. Ainsley and Kayla are looking out for you. So just, we have at the back, Emma D'Souza, I think, in the blue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Secretary of State, for that great contribution, Emma D'Souza. And I have a question here because you noted the last episode of Dairy Girls. I too cried watching the last episode of Dairy Girls. If you haven't seen it, please do. Yeah. I also cried when watching a documentary by RTE about the killing of Sean Brown. And if you haven't seen the killing of a GAA chairman, I certainly recommend you also watch that. So my question to you is about the Brown family and legacy in Northern Ireland. So the Brown family have asked for a public inquiry, the court have ordered it, you've denied it, and you've asked the Brown family to engage with a structure they don't believe in, don't trust. And I suppose, is there an issue with trying to force families to use a structure within the Legacy Act that they don't support?
Well, thank you for your question. Now, I'm slightly limited in what I can say because the Sean Brown case and the appeal that the British government has brought against the ruling of the court ordering the establishment of a public inquiry is live and is going to be considered. But I have said in the House of Commons, I want there to be a full, thorough, independent investigation into the terrible, shocking murder of Sean Brown. And I met the family, and I wrote to them subsequently and said, I would encourage you, I'm not going to hold a public inquiry, but I would encourage you to talk to Sir Declan Morgan and his team about what they might be able to do to assist you. And the reason we are appealing the judgment is not because of the Sean Brown case, as I explained to the ad hoc committee yesterday. It is because there is a bigger, much bigger principle, a constitutional principle, that arises from this case, and it is this: who in the UK system should have the power to order a public inquiry? And up until this moment in time, it has been the government of the day, not the courts, the government of the day. So the appeal is trying to persuade the courts that it should remain the government of the day that orders public inquiries and not the courts. It's about the division of responsibilities between the executive and the judiciary. What I would say about ICRA is this: I voted against the Legacy Act. What it did was to get rid of civil cases, immunity, and it said you can't have any of those, civil cases and inquests. It brought in immunity, which would allow people who had done the most appalling things, including those who killed Sean Brown, to gain immunity and walk away, which is one reason why so many people were so opposed to it. And it said you've all got to go into the independent commission to have cases looked at. I could have taken the decision to abolish it, but I thought carefully about this, and if you go back to the Stormont House Agreement, it proposed two bodies, one for information recovery, one for continuing investigation, and in effect, and indeed the courts have commented on the fact that the two functions are combined in ICRA. So what is the benefit, I said to myself, in abolishing it, wasting all the money that you've spent getting rid of the staff, halting the growing number, it's small, I grant you, but halting the growing number of investigations that they are undertaking because families have approached them, including, for example, the families of those killed in the Guildford pub bombing. So that includes killing in England, just to recreate something that looks not terribly dissimilar from what is in place currently. Now, having said that, I recognise completely, because I've met a very large number of bodies representing victims and survivors, and I get the argument that is made about lack of confidence. So I am committed to fundamental reform of the way in which ICRA works, but I'm also committed to removing immunity, which the courts have struck down thanks to Article 2 of the Windsor Framework, but I've introduced this secondary legislation that will finally discard it. Bringing back civil cases, the secondary legislation will do that, and restoring some of the inquests that were brought to a halt. So I would simply argue that the context is now very, very, very different to that created by the Legacy Act, to which I was so opposed. I know not everybody agrees with me, but the test of the commission in the end, people say I have no confidence in it. There's a history of bodies in Northern Ireland that when established, people said, I have no confidence in that whatsoever, but in time, they realised, well, it can do something for me. And the test of ICRA will be when it completes its work in each individual case, produces a report for the family, maybe leads to a potential prosecution if there is evidence. The judge of whether it works or not will be the families themselves. And we won't know that until they have gone on a bit more with their work.
Quick back on that, just 1 second. For those of us in Northern Ireland, we know the importance of language. So your point about having a different structure, what would be the purpose? In the context of Northern Ireland, language matters. So yes, creating a different structure and giving it a different name, it might essentially have the same purpose, but it can have a transformative effect in Northern Ireland because of how important language is. And I suppose in the case of Sean Brown, that widow is 88. They don't want to engage with that structure. They want a public inquiry. So my closing statement would just be, why not just give it to them?
Thank you for your question. We have hands over here, I think. This gentleman has the microphone. Sure.
A couple of years ago, there was a documentary, Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, that was published and was shown shortly thereafter here in the U.S., which I found very, very impressive. And I just wondered what sort of impact that had in Ireland and in the UK?
Well, it's one of a number of programs that have had an impact. Because, with the passage of time, truths can come out that it is very difficult to see emerge in the immediate aftermath of the event. Bloody Sunday is probably the clearest example of that, because that day when the Prime Minister, David Cameron, with whom I disagreed on many, many fronts, it was the finest speech I ever heard him make in the House of Commons. I was sitting on the opposition benches when he apologised and said that the 13 who had been murdered were completely innocent. And as he was saying that, the cameras in Derry were capturing the hands and the fists coming out of the window of the Guildhall on the first floor, because the families were listening to what the Prime Minister was saying. And finally, they felt the truth had been told and an apology had been given. And those are, cathartic moments. Nothing is going to bring back their loved ones who have been murdered. And it is a reflection, I think, on many societies that it can take a long time. The Hillsborough disaster, the 89 who died at the FA Cup semi-final. Well, think of the length of time it took for the truth about what happened in Hillsborough to come out. Some people take a very close interest in these things. Others, they don't, because life has moved on, including in Northern Ireland. But that legacy of the Troubles, above all for the families who live every day with the pain and the trauma of those they have lost. And when I meet them, and they say very simply, we just want to know what happened. And many of them will add, we recognise passage of time, a prosecution is very unlikely, but we just want to know what happened. And I am seeking to create a framework, a system that enables that to take place for them, because it's about them, above all. It is about them.
Thank you. Yes, just here on the second from the front in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Mr. Brennan. My name is Seamus McCreesh. I'm from Limerick originally, but I've been here a number of years now, and actually did my master's here at the McCourt School. So thank you very much for coming. My question is to go back to the Good Friday Agreement and your role within it. It states that the Secretary of State of Northern Ireland can call a border poll when they see fit. And I'm sure, as you know, it's worded quite vaguely. So ignoring the likelihood of such an event or the possibilities or the pros and cons, I'm just wondering if you could tell us what specific data points you will look for in making that decision and the sources. Thank you.
Well, I was asked exactly this question yesterday by the ad hoc committee, because some people say, well, what criteria? I think that's what you're asking me. What criteria are going to be used? Now, I reflected on this when I was the Shadow Secretary of State, because I knew I'd be asked the question. Are you going to say, right, it's going to be 6 opinion polls over 2 years carried out by certified, reputable polling agencies showing a lead of X% on a rolling basis over Y period of time? I don't think that is a sensible thing to do. Above all, because we all need to go back and read and reread the words in the Good Friday Agreement. And what it says is that the Secretary of State shall call a border poll if he, I think that's the word, but he or she is of the view that in the event of such a poll being held, a majority of people in Northern Ireland would vote for United Ireland. And all I can observe, and I believe in that, when I say we are committed to the letter and the spirit of the Good Friday Agreement, I absolutely am. This government is. All of us should be, because those words were very, very carefully crafted. Every single word of the Good Friday Agreement was weighed and considered before it was committed in perpetuity to paper, and it leaves the responsibility on the holder of this office, whoever it is. All I would observe is that I have seen no evidence, whatever sources you choose to draw attention, I have seen no evidence that in Northern Ireland at the moment, a majority of people would vote for a united Ireland. I stand to be corrected by anybody in the audience, but I think we all know that to be the case, and therefore the moment has not yet arrived. It's in the distance. I mean, only time and circumstances will tell how far in the distance it is, but it's important to uphold the words that were agreed nearly 27 years ago.
Thank you. Second from the back, Katie Hayward, just in the...
Thank you very much, Katie Hayward from Queen's. I'm going to preface this by saying I'd asked the same question from a minister for the Irish government. It's in relation to the appointment of an independent reviewer and transition from paramilitarism. This is against the express wishes of our Minister for Justice, Naomi Long.
Yes.
And it's in an area of devolved competence, and it's also in an area in which obviously she knows a lot more and has had a lot more direct experience than any minister in Dublin or London. So even setting aside the topic, we all agree we want to see the scourge of paramilitarism gone. I want to ask you about given that actions speak louder than words, what are the implications and risks of both governments going over the heads of a devolved minister in this way?
Well, Katie, thank you for that question. I mean, Naomi Long has made her views, well, only too clear. I mean, she said she thought the decision was madness. And I've talked to her about it. I take a different view. And the reason I take the different view, I alluded to in my remarks. I agree with the first part of what she always says. They should have gone a long time ago. But then we all know they haven't. And given that the IRC has been given this responsibility, given that the Irish government wished this person to be appointed, just to scope, I think it's worth giving a go. Now, that may not seem to you or to the rest of the audience to be a wholly scientific basis, but I would make this point that progress in Northern Ireland in years gone by has involved talking to people you'd much rather not talk to, okay? Now, when it comes to the criminality, this is not an alternative to cracking down on drugs and extortion and loan sharking, which a number of paramilitaries are engaging in. That's what the PSNI are doing, and they have 100% from all of us, from Naomi, from me, and the people of Northern Ireland in undertaking that task. It is said that there are voices amongst the paramilitary organisations who say we would like to move away. I've been very clear in the House of Commons because some people ask, well, what does it mean? What would disbandment involve? What would group transition look like? And I said, there's no question of paying anyone any money to go away. Just to be clear, no question of paying any money to go away. And the measures of whether a process succeeds or not is, does recruitment stop? Are people able to leave paramilitary organisations that they joined before without penalty or pain? Does sexual exploitation, grooming of people end? Is there an end to punishment, beatings, to intimidation and coercion in communities? And on my first visit to Wave, many conversations have had a very profound impact upon me, but there was a man sitting there who described to me how in the last 2 or 3 years, 2 people had been told they should turn up for a punishment beating by appointment. Now, I sat there and thought, what? But that tells you everything you need to know about the grip that paramilitaries still have in some communities, the lack of trust in the police, the fact you're going to be returning to the same area. The idea of that happening elsewhere in the United Kingdom, it's not the same. And if that is what is still going on all of these years afterwards, despite all of the really determined efforts have been made, including by Naomi and her team at the DOJ and the PSNI, then I think it is worth trying. It may or may not succeed, I don't know. But I think it is the right thing to do. And we'll see what the independent person, having done their scoping exercise. Some people think this is the start of a process. No, it isn't. It is someone going out and talking to lots of people, come back and say, well, this is what I found. And I look forward to seeing the result of their work, and we hope to be able to appoint that person in the not too distant future.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, I believe. So I'm looking for hands over here, actually in the front row, I think is...
Hi, my name is Mary Greer. My mom was Irish. Thanks to the organizers. And Mr. Secretary, I had the chance to work in Bosnia right after the Dayton Agreement was signed and the implementation mostly on the judicial and legal side. And I'm curious, not knowing as much about the Good Friday agreements, do you have any, in hindsight, any reflections or any observations that you, in the Dayton Agreement, it was the power sharing that remains still, you know, the problem to this day, but that's just one component of the Dayton Agreement. Are there any things that you, just in hindsight, think might have been included or not included, or
It's a very good question. Yeah.
And I know it's different countries and very different situations, but similarities as well. Thank you.
Well, part of human existence and the experience of all of us is to learn from what has gone in the past and apply successes, failures to what we do next. But it was an extraordinary process, and I talked earlier in answer to the question about the courage that the leaders showed, at great personal risk, to decide to say, you know, Gerry Adams, Martin McGuinness said to the Provisional IRA, you know what, we are not going to be able to bomb and kill and murder Northern Ireland out of the United Kingdom. We're going to have to put down our weapons, and we're going to have to engage in a political process. And that was quite remarkable indeed. And for David Trimble to say, in effect, you know what? They are nearly half the population. We're going to have to share power with our fellow citizens in Northern Ireland. And it was a product of the time, the circumstances, the weariness at the continued killing and the violence. And it was a coming together. It was a constellation of circumstances, events, and people, and never giving up. About 2 or 3 months ago, I had the privilege of attending a performance of the play Agreement at the Gate Theatre in Dublin. I can see 1 or 2 nods around the room. What a fabulous play that is, because it really painted the picture of how difficult it was for the parties to the conflict to take that step. You think of all the pressures. How's this going to play amongst my party? I'll be screamed at. I'll lose my job. All of that came out. And I had the privilege of meeting the cast afterwards. And there was a rather surreal moment when the woman who played Mo Molan came in, having removed her wig and her the clothes she was wearing in the performance, and somebody said, "Secretary of State, would you like to meet the Secretary of State?" And it was, and I knew Mo Molan, and she was really quite remarkable. But it really goes back to your question, sir, about interest in events in Northern Ireland, because they've played in Belfast and in Dublin and here in the States. But they said to me, "Do you think if we brought the play to London, anyone would come and watch it?" I said, "What? Of course they would. It's fabulous." And we have a series of plays in London about politics that some people might think is not terribly interesting. Well, boy, is it interesting. So I really hope one day they will come, and more people will come to see what was achieved by that coming together of the constellation of forces and beliefs and determination, not giving up. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, George Mitchell tells the famous story. He went home. I think his son had just been born. He said, I'm not sure I can carry on. And his wife said to him, we are going back, because this is about all the other babies in Northern Ireland have been born, and it's about their future. I'll look after our son. Now you go back and finish this work. And that's what he did. Now, isn't that fantastic? Absolutely fantastic.
Well, on that powerful and poignant note, please join me in thanking the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. Thank you very much, sir.
I enjoyed that a lot.
A pleasure.
I think we should reconvene because while we had two really wonderful talks this morning, we've got a third one now from John Boucher, who Carolyn is from American University is going to be interviewing and trying to get some sense out of. John is really a force of nature, I would say. Since he came to Northern Ireland, he has really stamped his personality across policing in a way which was really important, because he came in at a time when there was a lot of uncertainty, and both internally and externally. And the task of policing in Northern Ireland, if the lot of a policeman is not a happy one, in Northern Ireland, it really is in the core of the discussion often about what does legitimacy look like. And not just the legitimacy of policing, the legitimacy of Northern Ireland. So political affairs, the issues of the past, how we're moving into the future, and the involvement of politicians in the structures of Northern Ireland make it always one of the areas where you need somebody with real political but also personal values to be leading, because otherwise the potential for difficult situations to emerge, which have bigger consequences than they apparently appear to have, is ever present. So I personally have always felt that having somebody like John Boucher at the helm is really important. John's history is of somebody who has actually been at the front line really for decades now in the Metropolitan Police, then as Chief Constable for Bedfordshire between 2015 and 2019. In Northern Ireland, I suppose his role was most prominent in leading the Canova inquiry, and that was probably one of the most difficult, complicated, dangerous, but nevertheless essential inquiries that has happened, even if it was 20 years after the Good Friday Agreement. And so John has a lot of thoughts on policing in Northern Ireland, on legacy issues, on where we might go, and we're really very privileged to have him here today. So thank you very much for coming. We look forward to what you have to say, and we look forward to the conversation with Caroline afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. The graveyard shift, the end of the week. So afterwards, we're all going to cheer. I'm going to throw this in the air, and we'll be done. Now, I very rarely speak from notes. I think I've done it twice now, once yesterday to the ad hoc committee and once at the Oxford British Irish Association last year. But I am going to read a speech I gave, which is slightly updated because the content of it for me is quite important. I don't want to miss anything. So please bear with me, and then we'll talk obviously about some other issues now, more contemporary issues in policing in Northern Ireland. So I want to talk to you about legacy, because of the importance of legacy in my view. So legacy is connected to a multitude of issues in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland, including societal well-being, economic strength and opportunity, about government relationships, UK and Irish, and trust and confidence of our communities in our governments and our police service. As the Chief Constable of the PSNI, the Police Service of Northern Ireland, I can unequivocally state that failure to address legacy in a manner that has the confidence of victims and stakeholders remains a fundamental barrier to communities having confidence in government institutions and in policing. Before I became the Chief Constable, as Duncan mentioned, I led the Canova investigations and wrote the Canova report that was published last March. That highlights continuing failures of governments, public authorities, political parties, and those who fought in the Troubles to acknowledge properly the hurt inflicted on victims, their families, of the many people who were murdered, or to provide them with a meaningful examination into the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths. Even the most uncontroversial information about what happened was withheld from families. This lack of disclosure about offences as serious as murder would not be tolerated anywhere else in the United Kingdom. Several high-profile investigations and inquiries have been commissioned into specific Northern Ireland legacy cases in the past. Each and every one has come up against non-disclosure and secrecy, and each produced reports which largely remain today classified as secret or even top secret. Successive Secretaries of State have listened, in my opinion, to at best weak and certainly outdated arguments about national security provisions, such as neither confirm nor deny, that have resulted in a complete lack of trust from families towards government institutions and our security forces. If I'd listened to those same arguments when I was doing Canova, when consulting with the lawyers of those agencies regarding my report, it would not have contained any of the key findings that I made. In fact, most of the report would not have been published. The secrecy surrounding legacy reports has fed conspiracy theories and hampered reconciliation. Legacy families will not trust in public institutions unless and until the authorities have given them the truth, acknowledged their loss, and provided them with an opportunity to tell their own stories. Information about Northern Ireland legacy cases has too often been withheld and suppressed because simply of concerns as to where it might lead. On becoming Chief Constable of the PSNI, I met lawyers and counsel for my organisation who sought to persuade me that once an inquest had opened, the police could not conduct investigations into that death, and the information that an agent had committed a murder could not be investigated, as to do so would breach national security provisions. Both positions are absolutely and manifestly wrong, but the fact that they advanced them to me was even more worrying. A perceived need to avoid undesirable outcomes should never be allowed to preempt disclosure and due process. Firstly, because this is wrong in principle, and second, because our public institutions can and should be trusted to act in the public interest without causing harm to individuals or national security. Where information suggesting the commission of a serious criminal offence is discovered or uncovered, it must be investigated and subjected to a criminal justice process where necessary. Mechanisms exist to ensure sensitive information is protected and competing public interests balanced. Crucially, and this is important, it is for the independent and impartial judiciary, it's for the courts to operate these mechanisms in public and not for the security agencies and governments to do so in private. Much of the truth of what happened in Northern Ireland during the Troubles is subject to obligations of confidentiality and secrecy, which often exist for good reason and which should not be lightly set aside. For different reasons, all sides of the conflict are sensitive about public disclosure of the past, of their own secrets, in particular, the direct or indirect identification of agents. I respect and do not dismiss these sensitivities, and I recognise that they can continue to apply even after somebody's death. I was the head of undercover policing and covert policing for the United Kingdom. I know all of these arguments better than most. Secret intelligence, the protection of sources, and the preservation of law, order, and national security are all means to a greater end, namely maintaining a stable and democratic society which is subject to the rule of law and in which human rights are protected, respected, and exercised freely. However, these values would be eroded if the protection of state agents rendered them immune from prosecution, or if agents were allowed to become instruments of unaccountable wrongdoing, or to use their status to commit crimes with impunity. Living in a democratic society, we would be appalled if another country acted in such a way, and we would all rightfully join international condemnation of any investigative failures. It's understandable that many of these legacy cases were not adequately investigated during the Troubles itself. The times were incredibly challenging and dangerous for all concerned. Terrorist groups intimidated victims, families, and witnesses. The security forces were exposed to continual threats. The then Royal Ulster Constabulary, the RUC, was the most dangerous police force in the world in which to serve due to its death toll and casualty numbers. The bravery, sacrifices and successes of the security forces must never, never be forgotten. Terrorists created an incredibly dangerous operating environment. I have huge admiration for those who served in the security forces during an unimaginably dangerous time in our history. It's the failures since the Good Friday Agreement of continued secrecy around legacy disclosure that's counterproductive and damaging to the confidence of communities in the authorities that are charged to protect them. I'm especially conscious as the Chief Constable of this as regards the trust in policing, which continues to be negatively impacted by legacy. Those in authority who continue to obfuscate and obstruct disclosure and access to information should consider how history will judge them. Literally every legacy family I've spoken to, and that number of families is in the hundreds, has been let down and had promises made to them that have been broken in some form or another. Most worryingly, many in authority responsible for helping them discover the truth about what happened have dismissed them, or even deliberately frustrated their efforts to discover what happened. I've heard repeatedly from senior officials in government that memories fade over time and families are often motivated by a political agenda. I have found these claims to be manifestly untrue. Families remember precisely what happened when such life-changing events occurred. Victims remember the song that was playing and the conversation they were having when the darkness struck as the bomb went off. They recall exactly what happened when terrorists came to their door. They remember exactly what was said when they were first told that their loved one had been killed. For some who investigated these crimes or committed these atrocities, perhaps memories might fade, but not for the families. They not only suffered the unimaginable loss of a loved one, they then experienced systemic obstruction when seeking to discover what happened. They deserve to be listened to, acknowledged, and told the truth. My Canova work was the latest in a long line of investigations and inquiries into troubles matters. Previous reports have not been published and therefore have not been made available for any public scrutiny. Lessons have not been learned, and there have been suspicions, justified or not, of cover-ups. Many victims and families I've met have long-held beliefs, suspicions and fears about these patterns of behaviour and the part they may have played in their particular cases. And they've been denied the truth for far too long. The Canova report effectively says to these individuals, you are not mad. This was happening and it should not have been. I hope that hearing this would have been meaningful to many of those concerned. I made clear from the start that victims and families would be at the heart of Operation Canova. Families often had no contact with the police after the murder of a loved one. In many cases, they were not even made aware that an inquest into their loved one's death was taking place. I made contact with every family, listened to their concerns, answered whatever questions I could, all for me to better understand what they'd been through. When designing Canova, I sought to ensure it was fully compliant with the European Convention of Human Rights and actively sought independent scrutiny throughout the inquiry. Of particular importance to the investigation was Article 2 of the Convention, which guarantees the right to life. Legally, Article 2 requires that such investigations are effective, independent, prompt, open to public scrutiny, and involve the next of kin. In early 2017, Alison Kilpatrick, the then Human Rights Legal Advisor to the Northern Ireland Policing Board, was tasked by the board to review Canova's compliance with the Human Rights Act and with the Convention. In her annual report to the board, she said from the outset Canova had sought full compliance with Article 2 and that we had clear mechanisms in place to ensure independence and avoid any real or perceived conflicts of interest. I subsequently appointed Alison to conduct a more comprehensive and independent review of the investigation. I also commissioned the independent National Police Chiefs Council Homicide Working Group to review Canova's performance from an intelligence and standard of investigations perspective. I also tasked the National Counter-Terrorism Policing Headquarters to ensure that any sensitive and complex elements of the inquiry were being correctly undertaken. Independent scrutiny was a critical success factor to Canova. In February 2020, Ms Kilpatrick published her initial report. She commented that Operation Canova investigation appears to be an exemplar of one which is commanded and controlled with every aspect of Article 2 firmly in mind. In January 2021, she produced a second interim report where she addressed Canova's effectiveness and independence. She stated that she remained entirely satisfied of Canova's Article 2 compliance. In a final report, in her covering letter, she said, "Canova really is an exemplar of what such an investigation can and should be. It's the best I have seen in all of my years' experience." The Homicide Working Group also reported positively about Canova's structures, operating model, and the priority given to victims and families, and described the overall approach as simply innovative. An independent victims group also conducted an independent review of Canova in relation to best practice and our approach to victims' rights. Its report identified several interrelated themes about Canova's legitimacy, building of trust with families, and carrying out effective investigations. These themes being that were recommended to all future inquiries that deal with victims, and particularly legacy cases, that it needs to be victim-centred, independent, have procedural fairness, transparency and public accountability, all of which Canova has demonstrated for the first time in a legacy investigation. But I encountered a number of challenges while leading Canova. Really difficult challenges, some of which I expected and some of which I did not. False allegations were made through the security forces that I'd released the names of agents. I was able to refute these allegations, but again, it was simply an effort to undermine me, as had happened to many who'd dealt with legacy before I had. Accessing information held by MI5, which largely consisted of historical materials that were owned by the police or the military, were really challenging. MI5's decision to classify as top secret an accumulation of secret documents was simply unexplainable, and solicitors representing former security service personnel who were to be interviewed by Canova as suspects were given unorthodox, unique, and, frankly, inappropriate access to MI5 material. As part of my Canova work, I read the reports of previous inquiries into legacy, all of which are still classified at top secret. They identified an unedifying history of the various inquiries facing the same challenges in obtaining information. These were legally commissioned inquiries, and information was not provided to them. Investigators had to confront constant efforts to undermine and frustrate them by agencies of the state. I recognise and understand the nervousness of many in the security forces who describe legacy inquiries as history being rewritten. But through a fair and independent investigative process that recognises the context of the times, such concerns can be addressed. These earlier legacy reports described a catalogue of unacceptable practices around how the security forces used agents during the Troubles. They evidenced a culture both then and subsequently of secrecy and resistance to fair and measured scrutiny, and of failing properly to disclose information. Most worryingly, these reports demonstrate a concerted and continued absence of any effort by those responsible for leading the security forces and by successive governments of even trying to establish the truth. In advance of giving evidence at the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee in Westminster in September 2020, I telephoned a number of my predecessors who led legacy inquiries and asked them what would they like to say to the committee. David Cox, the former head of the PS9 Historical Inquiries team, said they, the PS9 Intelligence Unit, always gave me a limited version of the truth. They invariably did not and will not give up information. Lord Stevens, referring to the security forces regarding his inquiries into legacy in Northern Ireland, said, "I was misled deliberately. I was criminally obstructed from doing my job by the RUC and the military, whilst MI5 failed to disclose information to me." Judge Rennie Pomerantz, who was the senior counsel to Judge Corey in the inquiries he conducted: "We could not compel material being provided. Others controlled what we received and when and how we received it, and the conditions in which we received it. They, MI5, made the entire process uncomfortable. The state viewed itself above the law." Mary Laverty, senior counsel to Judge Smithick and his inquiry: "They, the security forces, made it incredibly hard. When will they decide they can reveal information?" Some of the things that I found in the Canova report were already identified in the previous reports I've described. Murders were committed by agents, including cases in which one agent murdered another agent. Cases in which agents were acting contrary to their instructions or tasking, and cases in which it is arguable that they were actually acting on behalf of the state. Some murders were the subject of advanced intelligence and so could have been prevented. There were cases in which such intelligence was not passed on or properly assessed, and cases in which this was done, but the security forces nevertheless decided not to take preventative action because to do so might have exposed the agent. Some of these cases were uniquely challenging for the security forces to deal with. They had to assess risks and consequences with limited information. They did so under exceptionally stressful conditions and time pressure, and were sometimes presented with dilemmas that really had no right answer, because protecting one individual would simply expose another. Mistakes and questionable decisions were inevitable and, in my view, understandable. I talk in my report about the importance and limits of secrecy in national security. Ensuring the operational effectiveness of the security forces is in the interests of national security always calls for secrecy. However, there is also a public interest in ensuring that the laws are not broken and that all public authorities, including the security forces, operate lawfully and compatibly with human rights, and this calls for external accountability and scrutiny. State agents do need to be protected through anonymity and secrecy, but that protection cannot confer de facto immunity or a right to act with impunity, as that would be wholly incompatible with the rule of law. Agents do not have a free license to break the law and should not be led to believe that they do. The neither confirm doctrine is a Cabinet Office mantra, and there's a guidance note that's provided that says this mechanism is used to protect sensitive information. It applies where secrecy is necessary in the public interest and where this mechanism avoids the risks of damage that a confirmation or a denial would create. Various legal judgments have recognised the importance of NCND, but they also stress it is not a legal rule or principle. It does not bind the courts and should not be applied on a blanket basis. Despite this, NCND has assumed a totemic status with the government and security forces. It's become an implacable dogma or mantra with the qualities of a high stone wall. NCND should be subjected to a review, particularly as to its routine application to troubles-related cases, in order to ensure that it's not allowed to wrongly obscure wrongdoing and criminality by the security forces or agents of the state. The Republican leadership failed to recognise and acknowledge the Provisional IRA's murderous activities and intimidation of families. Members of PIRA's ISU, their internal security unit, were responsible for torture, inhumane and degrading treatment and murder, including that of children, vulnerable adults, those with learning difficulties, and those who were entirely innocent of what they were accused. Allegations that individuals working as agents were sometimes motivated simply by a desire to eliminate rivals, and even the partners of those in extramarital affairs. Confessions to being agents, whether in audio recordings or in writing, were obtained through violence or deception. None of these so-called confessions are reliable. The security forces also failed to protect those accused or suspected by PAYRA of being agents and failed to bring those responsible for harming them to justice. We identified occasions where agents were under surveillance by the security forces and the surveillance team was then withdrawn, leaving the victim exposed to torture and murder. Failings extended to PAYRA's internal security unit members not being arrested and not being prosecuted when the evidence was there. This permitted murders and those involved in torture and abduction to escape the rule of law. And this happened repeatedly. Where we established that agents were involved in murder, there was no evidence to suggest that the authorities considered holding those agents liable for their criminal acts. There is a view among some that to accept that the security forces got things wrong somehow hands the moral high ground to the terrorists. It does not. To expose such matters is a sign of the strength of a working democracy. In finishing, the Good Friday Agreement brought about a long-awaited peace process in Northern Ireland, stopping the continual cycle of violence and preventing further suffering. The measures taken were brave, innovative, and necessary, but the compromises made could never take account of the huge sacrifices victims and families have made. They had hoped that once peace was established, they would find out the truth of what happened. This did not happen. Providing a trusted framework for informing legacy families of what happened to their loved ones remains the unwritten chapter of the Good Friday Agreement. My report highlights the security forces' failings, but it was PAYRA that commissioned and sanctioned the activities of the Internal Security Unit. It was PAYRA that committed brutal acts of torture and murder against those accused of being agents. Incredibly, there have been no convictions of the perpetrators responsible for PAYRA murders of those accused of being agents. None. In my view, this is linked to the dogmatic application of the NCND policy. Not only does this prevent disclosure of information to families, applied internally, it means legacy investigations have not been able to see a good deal of relevant material and properly apply the rule of law. Those people who did assist the authorities in tackling the threat from terrorism by working as agents did so at great, great personal risk. These individuals would surely have expected the agencies they were working for to at least to try to protect them and to bring to justice anyone who harmed or killed them. The security forces have a duty to uphold their values: fairness, honesty, integrity, the respect of human rights. When and how an organisation responds when faced with legitimate accusations of wrongdoing demonstrates how closely it truly holds those values. The state has a duty to ensure an independent and effective investigation is conducted whenever there are reasonable grounds to assess that it, the state, has contributed to or been complicit in serious criminality. This is a founding characteristic of a well-functioning democracy. It's critically important that those who keep society safe can be trusted with the authority and powers to do so, and that they are accountable for their actions. Canova families remain really frustrated that the recommendations from the report were fudged by the government of the day. As the Chief Constable of the PSNI, I'm more than aware of the need to secure trust and confidence of all of our communities. That's something I'll endeavour to do throughout my tenure as Chief Constable, from all the lessons I've learned from meeting these incredible families.
So I want to start by thanking you for sharing.
No time for questions now.
I'm going to ask you a bunch. But I do want to thank you for sharing your successes of Canova, because I think there were many.
but also the fact that you're willing to share the frustration, I think, is very important. It reflects, in many respects, as you said yourself, how the families feel. And so thank you for speaking from the heart. The first question I want to ask you was really to get you to comment on something that the Sosnies said earlier today. Two things, actually. The first was in response, I believe, to Emma DeSousa's question about the government delaying the decision on this inquiry of Sean Brown because there was a principle at stake. Who should make the call in calling an inquiry, the executive or the courts? That's the first question. And the second is his comment that he did not vote for the legacy legislation and does want to get rid of it, but he's not going to do that until he has something to replace it with, and that he will do that on parliamentary time. So I wonder if you could comment on both of those.
Well, firstly, the Sean Brown case. That's one of the first cases I looked at when I became Chief Constable for the inquest. The inquest couldn't finish. It couldn't come to any conclusions because of the amount of sensitive material there was. And I agreed a gist, a form of words, with the coroner, which had not been done before. And I'm now in the Supreme Court against the government in June, linked to the Sean Brown case, but specifically about another inquest, the Thompson case, where I did the same thing with a separate coroner. And the government feel that gists shouldn't be done. Gists are always done. It feels to me that things are just different in Northern Ireland because we as the security forces were on one of the sides of this. And I think sometimes even the best intended of people, such as the Secretary of State, listen too much to the lawyers and not to their own head and heart. So the Sean Brown case, I said publicly that I would support, and the PSNI will give all information to any public inquiry. So the family know my position on that. You will have heard, obviously, the Secretary of State said that this is a legal principle about who can call a public inquiry. Sean Brown's widow is not interested in a legal principle. She just wants to know what happened. And I think to have called a public inquiry, to have had some mechanism where the family could have got to understand as much as we can now, all these years later, what happened, is incumbent on all of us. And that type of inquiry is the way the family feel that they can best have confidence in the process. They don't want to go to the commission. So that position and the legal principle for me is one that should play second fiddle to what the family need.
What about parliamentary time?
So yeah, listen, he has got a challenge, Secretary of State, trying to get time in Parliament in Westminster in London to get bills agreed is a real challenge. Mm-hmm. And Northern Ireland is not at the forefront of time in Parliament. If you see any debates on legacy, you basically see a handful, if that, of people in the chamber. Northern Ireland does not have the... It's not high enough on the government's agenda, I don't think. Listen, everybody's waiting to see what Hillary's going to do about this bill. There were some very strong words about reforming and repealing it. There's many things said now in Northern Ireland. It's more like tweaking slightly and amending a little bit. I think fundamental changes will have to occur for victims groups and families to buy into it. Currently, there's more cases with the PSNI investigating legacy cases that fall outside of the period covered by the bill than the Commission have actually got families go to them. Now that's not where we want to be. I want the Commission to succeed, but we've got to listen to the families who've seen every different type of inquiry and know what's authentic and what's not. And just by my comments this morning in the speech that I gave last year at Oxford, you can see why the families feel very suspicious about these processes. So they've got to do something to change the approach, and they need to do it quickly.
So you've met with, I think you said at one point in the last couple of days, at least 100 victims or families of victims. And I think people know them, but they don't know them. And so I'm wondering, as someone who's met with them frequently, what's something that you know about them that would surprise the rest of us?
Well, I think I mentioned actually, a lot of people told me that I'd be meeting, troublemakers in a way. These aren't troublemakers, they're victims. They've lost loved ones. They've never been treated properly with respect and decency, yet they actually conduct themselves with real elegance, real humility. We could learn far more from listening to the families than listening to our lawyers, in my view. What I would say is, and sometimes I think people in the security forces think these families who are in the media trying to find out what happened to their loved ones are just doing it for political reasons. They're not. I've found that not to be the case at all. And most of the families I've dealt with aren't represented by a victims group. They don't want to go to victims groups, actually. They just want anonymity, but they want to know what happened. And legacy takes all sorts of shapes and sizes. I know people look at criminal justice processes, but there are so many stories I could tell you about what it's meant just to be treated properly and listened to, just to be able to give their account. There's so many stories, but one I give you is that one guy, and it was a Miami show band incident at Banbridge, and he survived that. And he flagged down a vehicle, and a young couple took him to a police station. And he wanted to find the couple who did that. And the police had told him there was no records, and I'm afraid we can't help you, can't find the couple. We found the couple. Wow. He wrote they wouldn't meet him actually because, so much time had passed, but they agreed to have a letter from him. Those things are really important because he just wanted to say thank you, but he'd never been given a chance to do it. So, listen, doing legacy right comes in all sorts of shapes and sizes. And I do worry about the commission, but I really want it to succeed. But it's got to be a human body. It's got to be empathetic. It's got to understand the different needs of the families. And it's got to be effective. It can't suffer from a lack of security, for a lack of information being given to it for security reasons. It's got to be robust. And time will tell, as the Secretary of State said this morning, as to what that will look like.
So I think families, and what I hear you saying and what I've heard as well in other contexts, that families just want information. They know at this point in time they can't get maximum justice. So the other side of that, of course, is that if you tell the secrets, the argument is, well, it will wreck things. So how do you convince people that letting the truth come out will not wreck things, that this is an important step to actually moving forward?
Yeah, honestly, telling the truth, once the truth sets you free, this isn't about, in a way, I think, if it is a strategy, the way the different inquiries are referred to, Judge Corey's inquiry, the Stevens inquiry, the Smithick inquiry, the way these inquiries have been frustrated has led, and the word collusion is now synonymous with legacy in Northern Ireland. Every family would say to me, is there collusion in this case, John? And I would say, well, what is collusion to you? What does it mean? Because people define it differently. We've already messed this up because it feels to me that everything that happened in Northern Ireland happened with collusion, and it didn't. When I've looked at these cases, I've been able to tell a significant number of nationalist families that the police actually did a really good job, but nobody went to see them. They didn't know that. I've shown them the records, the arrests. Because of some of the forensic work that's done and because of our advancement in forensic techniques, we've been able to identify who's responsible for those cases. It's so important that we get this right and the sky will not fall in. If anything, what we still see in Northern Ireland, what divisions still exist, is because we've not freed the anchor of legacy. And we deal with sensitive information in every other genre of the agencies in the UK, in Scotland, in England, in Wales, in London, all the time. And we deal with it in a way that doesn't put any national security at risk. And we prosecute people. We prosecute terrorists. We prosecute people who, threaten our national security. And these cases are reported on in the media through court processes. For some reason in Northern Ireland, and it's a culture as opposed to any particular, there's no different legal framework, we haven't done that. And I think strategically we've got that very, very, very badly wrong. Especially we want Northern Ireland to move forward so the next generation actually start to feel free from the burden of legacy. And I think that's in the gift of this government, I have to say that. With this Prime Minister, this Secretary of State, I think it's in their gift. It takes leadership to do this, but I think it is in their gift.
So I'm struck by what you said about collusion not actually being part of many of the cases. So was it really a symbol of distrust, the use of this word for a lot of families, because there's no trust in the institutions?
Yeah, the family, the word collusion, it's interesting. John Stevens first used it in Legacy Case in one of his reports, and he used it because he went to see the military, and he asked the military about any informants they had, and the military said, we don't have any informants. They had a unit that managed informants. He was told that senior officers, police officers and members of the military, were briefing that they weren't to cooperate with him. So he started to talk about the unknowns and that this was collusion, things were happening. We have an ombudsman, so it's an oversight body who looks at policing now in Northern Ireland. And there's quite an interesting legal debate about the ombudsman's use of the word collusion and collusive behaviours. There has to be due process. So I get frustrated with the word collusion because often when I've looked at cases where collusion is seen to be at play, it's not at play. We got things wrong, but it's not collusion. Equally, by the way, I know of cases, and they've been in the public domain, where police officers, for me, this is really obviously infuriating, members of the military committed criminal acts. That's criminal acts. It's not collusion. They are committing criminal offences. If we're not arresting people who should be arrested, that, for me as a police officer, I commit an offence by not doing my job. So I don't like the word collusion, but it's come about because of this state secrecy, because of John's frustration. Then Judge Corey used the word collusion. Judge Smithick used the word collusion. They each did a different definition, but it's because of the frustration of not getting the information. So they think there must be something to see there, which seems to be the Ombudsman's position. If the Ombudsman can't actually find wrongdoing from police investigations, they then say there must be collusive behaviours at play. Well, I'm afraid I struggle with that concept. Unless you can actually demonstrate it, prove that something's gone wrong.
So a lot of people are filling the void with theories.
Because we've not done our job. We've not been sufficiently transparent and let people know what happened. And if we got things wrong, listen, these were wickedly difficult times. I've walked through some of those cases where, goodness me, I wouldn't have wanted to be in the shoes of the people who are investigating those crimes and trying to deal with what was happening during the Troubles. None of the security agencies around the globe could have dealt with it. It was such an incredibly difficult period. But what we should do is now try and cleanse ourselves of it. And I'm not talking about being, accusatorial towards the security forces or anyone. Let's just let people know what happened in their individual cases as best as we can, because the reality is, by the way, because these cases were so long ago, witnesses are no longer alive, some documents are no longer there, the evidence is difficult. One of my Canova cases, 3 police officers were murdered in October 1982. And recently, we charged somebody with that, with those 3 murders. But that's rare because of the difficulties in getting evidence from all that time ago. But it's still possible, but it is very rare. And I have to say, most families I speak to are not after a prosecution particularly, but they just want to know what happened to their loved one. Was he on his own? Did he get the last rites? They just want to know what we know. And a lot of that's not national security information. That's just the decent thing to do.
Right. I want to switch gears and ask you about representation on the police force. So the Patton report, 50-50 representation across the 2 communities was the bar to achieve. Do you still support 50-50, or is there a new ratio you'd like to meet?
So we currently, the PSNI, we've got about 32% of our officers are from nationalist Catholic backgrounds. And we've just done a recruitment campaign. And the applicants for the student officer roles, we're about 28-29%, I think. Now, I want it higher than that. I want it to be at 50%. But the 50-50 thing was brought in by Chris, and I speak to Chris Patton and the team, there's some members of the team, I think Bob's in here today, did some incredible work just to try to reset policing. I'm very, very, supportive of what the security forces did during the Troubles. I'm more frustrated about what we've done since the Troubles in not giving people information. But the 50-50 issue, it was to try to get the policing service in Northern Ireland up to over 30%, which we are at. But we have got so much more to do to make sure that our organisation is representative of the people that we're there to police, including, visible ethnic minority communities. That's about 8% in Northern Ireland. We are way below that in the police service of Northern Ireland. I'm delighted that 4% of the recent applicants are from those communities. Working class Protestants. I'm really focused on trying to get working class Protestants into the PSNI. So we've got to do lots of work, and obviously the Catholic nationalist community is a constituency that I would really like to see in our next round of applications, which will be next year, to get that up nearer to 40, over 40%. That's linked to legacy, some of that. Because when these young people see another story in the newspaper that's negative, that fits into the stereotype about security forces acting differently towards a particular community, which we do not, that doesn't help. In recent weeks, I have to say this about the PSNI, and forgive me because you'll have some far more interesting questions than this, but a number of my officers went into a house fire in a place called Dungannon. 2 children were in there crying, and they were going to die. And 2 adults were going to die. And the officers went in there, and I phoned them each the next day. They were on a night duty shift, so they'd not spoken to anybody, but none of them had slept. 8 officers actually went into the house. Each one at one point when they're in the house didn't think they were going to get out, and got quite upset with me because, they've got families and stuff like this. They're not asking questions, is this a Catholic house, is this a Protestant house? That's what they do. And recently, and this is linked to legacy as well, we have unacceptable levels of violence against the police in Northern Ireland. We're assaulted, my officers are assaulted far more than officers elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And last weekend in Derry City in Strabane, we had a number of officers assaulted, and I phoned them all. And I phoned one, and I said, and he'd been threatened by a lady with a knife who's a drug addict. And I said, what are you doing? He said, I'm trying to find this girl, boss. I said, what do you mean trying to find her? She failed to appear at court or something. He said, no. There's a brilliant project here called ARC Fitness. It's run by an ex-nurse who was a drug addict. If I can get her on this program, I think it'll really help her. That doesn't matter what background she's from. And a final story, a lady came to see me from a family very much involved in a Troubles case, but she wanted to talk to me. Her son, gone off the rails at 15, literally smashing everything up in their house. Same at the school. They've been to the doctor, been to social worker, got him some counselling, not worked. One of her friends said, why don't you phone the police, just to see if it's sort of almost to scare him to stop doing this violence. And one of my officers takes him each week to a gym at Newton Ards Police Station and just trains with him. And since he's been doing that, this kid's not done anything wrong. He just needed something. Doesn't matter what background any of these people come from, the PSNI is there to look after everybody. That's the PSNI, and that's the story, actually, that we need to say about the organisation.
So I have a really quick follow-up on that. So, I think we know what the obstacles to working class Protestants or people from Republican backgrounds are to going into the police, but what are the obstacles that would keep immigrants from going into the police, and how could you address that?
So we had really quite worrying riots last year. You may have seen it. In August last year, there was an incident in Southport in England. Lots of false information on social media. You'll have seen the same things happen here, I've got no doubt. And we had riots that were targeted against our Muslim communities. I went to speak to numerous families, and they basically all told me that they'd suffered continual offences against them, antisocial behaviour, racial abuse, criminal damage to their properties. We as a society in Northern Ireland should have learnt about communities not getting on. So we've got a lot to do, not just the PSNI, but across communities in Northern Ireland to make sure that all communities feel valued in Northern Ireland. And I am determined, because currently our representation of those visible ethnic minority communities is woefully low. We need to do some work to get those numbers up, and we are doing that. So we're having various events. I'm going to a number of schools, as are my officers, to try and just get policing onto the radar of some of those kids as a profession in the future.
I want to turn to paramilitaries, and I bring this topic up, and I brought to mind a Faulkner quote from the U.S. South, where I grew up. And this quote is, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." And I think that's true of paramilitaries in Northern Ireland. So I want to ask you a couple of questions about this. The first is, can you arrest your way out of paramilitarism? And if not, what do you do?
I'll have a good go at it, I'll tell you that much. So it was interesting, the question that Secretary of State got about this and the interlocutor idea from the Independent Reporting Commission. Listen, I think we're the stick. I'm a traditional cop. A lot of these paramilitary organisations are involved in drug dealing, antisocial behaviour, intimidation, violence against women and girls. We need to go after them. As soon as they put their heads above the parapet for any sort of criminality, we need to be going after them. The biggest problem I've got to do that is our numbers are so low because policing has been abandoned almost since 2010. So in 2010, the police budget was about £1 billion for the PSNI. It's less than that now. The health budget was 3.3 billion, and it's now 8.5 billion. And a lot of our work is dealing with frontline mental health issues. If I've not got my officers in those communities where the paramilitaries are, the paramilitaries have got the structures in those communities. So they will be in that space. So the first issue is, and I've been saying this to all of the politicians, you need to back us so we get our number. And everybody agrees the PS9 numbers are unacceptably, dangerously low. So we're currently going through a process since I arrived of trying to get those numbers back up to somewhere near to a level where we can deal with things. We have got an extraordinarily successful team that targets paramilitary groups. The recovery of drugs, guns, the arrests, the prosecutions are incredibly impressive. We also, though, have to make sure that the people in those communities who are tempted to go into those paramilitary groups, they have opportunities in life. There's that socio-economic, fairness that there needs to be. And interestingly, the interlocutor idea I'm often asked about, and I do tend to duck it because obviously the Justice Minister has said she is against it. I'll take all the help I can get, but don't get me involved in that. That's a political decision. We'll be the stick. We'll go and arrest them. And we need to keep driving that, if you like, law enforcement agenda. And that's my simple way of approaching it.
So paramilitaries in Northern Ireland, I think, carry a veneer of politics around them. And the question I hear often posed is, why do we treat them as if they do have politics? Should we just call them criminals and, to some degree, yank that cape of politics off their back?
Yeah, listen, it's interesting this because I get told you're going to meet a community leader, and I look at some of the background. I thought, well, that's not a community leader, that's a criminal. So there's something about the acceptance in society. We have to challenge that to move society forward. And everybody talks about, and it's a difficult thing. I've been working in Northern Ireland now since around 2015. This has been a societal issue for many, many years. If people want to leave the stage from a paramilitary perspective, I don't see anything stopping them. They can leave the stage. They can go and do anything else they want to do in society to be good citizens. The interlocutor idea, if that means conversations for group transition, and that results in less people being intimidated, less drug dealing, I'm all for that. But it's something that, it's got to be a collective response across the piece, not just from the police. We'll do the policing bit, but I don't see any blockages to why paramilitaries can't transition away.
I'm going to ask one question. I'm getting the time. Northern Ireland did not do a traditional DDR, disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration program. And I remember talking to Billy Mitchell, who was in the UVF back in, I think, 2003 or 2004 before he died. And, he said what we want is an honorable path out. But most of the people, like Billy, have died. So when you're talking about a path out, there isn't necessarily an honorable path, or maybe that's not what they need. But what do you go into? What do you reintegrate into if your life has been to be a paramilitary person who's exploiting people, extorting them?
Well, I suppose my question back is, what's the difference between, it's Northern Ireland, so we call them paramilitaries, to gangs in London that I've dealt with? What's the difference? Some people then make a life choice. Normally it's because they meet somebody. For young guys, they meet somebody who gets them to start behaving themselves. It's a relationship. It's values. You focus on something else. You know, you might, unfortunately in life, make some poor choices as to who you're going to associate with and what you're going to do, and you mature. So I listen, the history with regards to the terrorist groups, paramilitaries, when does that history stop? So I'm very simple about this. A lot of these guys, and they're of a certain generation now as well, these, if they want to say that they're paramilitaries, that's fine, we'll just step away from it. A lot of the younger guys, it's not paramilitaries, they're gangs. They're drug gangs. They're gangs. And
that's where the stick comes in.
That's the stick. We go and deal with them. You're being told off now.
Yeah, we're being told, we have to stop. I could keep asking you to lots of questions, and I'm mindful we don't have time for audience questions, but please bother our esteemed guest here with questions after. My apologies.
I think a round of applause is due to... Thank you very much. John, thank you very much for the honesty and for the clarity. I think it's an important conversation that's really live in Northern Ireland, and the willingness to go to the heart of it directly is very much appreciated. So thank you very much for coming here and doing that here. I suppose I was thinking what the gist was. I think the gist is that truth-telling has been subordinated to NCND and to national security, and that should stop. But I also was very taken by what you said, which is people can tell what's authentic and what's not. And for an awful long time, I've always felt, I was involved, as I said, in that programme Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, that we have a lot of storytelling. We just don't have story hearing, because there has been a process in the political process that story hearing might be dangerous. And so it's often an obscured point of view. So what I'm quite interested in is setting up what is the mechanism through which, if you like, somebody who's heard it is somebody who knows they've been heard. How does somebody know they've been heard? Because I often feel that with the victims' organisations, which I know very well, they have spent a long time telling their stories, but they never feel that anybody has authentically heard them. And I think that that for me is a critical change, marking something that we still have to do 25, 27 years after a peace process which talks high, but for some people continues to deliver too low. This has been a really important day for us, because we wanted as together to produce an opportunity not just to, if you like, celebrate and to sell Northern Ireland, but also to consider some of the issues and some of the learning that's coming out of it. I think that what we've heard today has been people who are really engaged in trying to think about what are pathways, either politically or through different legislative arms that they have to have, or through the potential for policing. So I think we've had a really good day. We try to keep it lively, and each year try to make it live and real. And I just, on behalf of Ulster University, want to say how grateful we are to our partners in the US. They're sitting here personally, but also their organisations for the amount of time and effort and energy and enthusiasm they bring to it every year. So it's really a joy to be part of it. I'm just going, before we finish, to ask for that Alison Juknovitz, who is for the Dean of the School, or sorry, is the Dean of the School of Public Administration, will come up from American University just to close, and then we'll be followed just finally by Colleen Parsons from Georgetown, who will finally bring it to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It is very tempting when talking about Northern Ireland, in the US especially, to focus on the past, in part because of Americans' experience of the Troubles were so jarring, and in part because Northern Ireland's successes in arriving at a peace agreement 27 years ago were so extraordinary. The motivation behind this collaboration, known as the Washington Forum on Northern Ireland, now in its third year, is to recognize and honor the ongoing work of the people of Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the rest of the United Kingdom in creating and institutionalizing peace in the present. As Senator George Mitchell, who graced this forum 2 years ago with an address said in Belfast on the occasion of the 25th anniversary of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, "History is never finished. It is up to the current leaders of Northern Ireland to act with courage and vision, to find workable answers to daily problems, to preserve peace, and to leave to the next generation peace, freedom, opportunity, and hope for a better future for their children." I hope you heard in today's program speakers willingness and ability to implement that mission. I hope you found yourself inspired by the efforts and ideas articulated about how to address ongoing problems of peace building alongside the happily ordinary policy problems of modern life. I would like to thank the Washington Ireland Forum for putting together another fantastic day of lectures and conversations. As interim dean of the School of Public Affairs at American University, it is my pleasure to see our faculty working so closely and collaboratively with the faculty from Georgetown and Ulster universities. We are so much stronger universities when we work together. And it is especially impressive to see people from Ireland, Northern Ireland, Great Britain, and my own country coming into dialogue every year during the special week of St. Patrick's Day's festivities. I also want to acknowledge and thank our esteemed speakers today, the Right Honorable Hilary Benn, the Honorable Emma Little Pengelly, the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary Sharon Hudson Dean, and the Chief Constable John Butcher. We have so much to learn from Northern Ireland, and we are grateful for their willingness to share their experiences, their insights, and their time with us today. I would also like to acknowledge the tremendous support of the British and Irish governments through the Irish Embassy and the Northern Ireland Office, plus the Northern Ireland Bureau here in DC, the Washington Ireland Program, the John and Pat Hume Foundation, and the Helfat Family Foundation Faculty Development Program in my own school. Thank you to you all. We look forward to many future opportunities for collaboration across all of these partnerships. I would like to offer a special thank you to the many staff members who helped make today possible. Yalin Zhang and the whole events team at the School of Public Affairs, Che Rao and the SPA communications team, especially Darren Mitchell, and Dante Bernarde here at Georgetown's Capitol campus.